one gunshot. 4 empires dead. 9 million soldiers never coming home. June 28th, 1914. A sunny morning in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand adjusts his uniform, unaware that in 3 hours, his blood will stain the cobblestones and ignite the world. What happened next defies comprehension. A 19-year-old with a pistol would trigger a war that toppled the Russian Tsar, shattered the Ottoman Empire, and reduced the mighty Austro-Hungarian realm to memory. The German Kaiser would flee to Holland in disgrace. 4 years later, the map of Europe would be redrawn in blood. This is the story of how civilization nearly destroyed itself. How poison gas choked soldiers in their trenches. How machine guns mowed down entire generations. How submarines turned passenger ships into coffins beneath the waves. You'll witness the Christmas truce of 1914, when enemies played football in no man's land. The horror of Verdun, where 700,000 men became casualties for a few miles of mud. The moment America entered a European war for the first time, and the final desperate German gamble that nearly won everything. But this isn't just about battles and dates. It's about the world that died between 1914 and 1918. About empires that ruled for centuries, crumbling in 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Welcome to the Great War, the conflict that ended the old world and birthed the modern age. Europe was about to commit suicide, and nobody saw it coming. 1914. The golden summer before the world burned. Electric lights blazed along the Champs-Élysées. Millionaires sailed first class on floating palaces across the Atlantic. In mid-1914, European markets still looked buoyant, but by late July panic would set in and exchanges would begin to close. But here's the twisted irony. Europe had just spent 25 years building the most sophisticated suicide machine in human history, and they called it peace. Norman Angel's bestseller, The Great Illusion, sat on nightstands across the continent, preaching that modern war was economically impossible. Too expensive. Too interconnected. Too civilized. Angel would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for this beautiful, catastrophic delusion. Meanwhile, Europe's leaders were playing a game of diplomatic Russian roulette. It started innocently, just 2 empires, Germany and Austria-Hungary, signing a mutual defense pact in 1879. Then Italy joined, forming the Triple Alliance. France, still bleeding from its humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War, seduced Russia into an alliance in 1894. Britain abandoned its splendid isolation and cozied up to France, then Russia. By 1914, Europe had divided itself into 2 armed camps, each promising to die for the other. A diplomat later called the alliance web a suicide pact, a metaphor that proved grimly apt. At the center of this powder keg sat 3 cousins who would drag the world into hell. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Queen Victoria's grandson, was a walking contradiction. Born with a withered left arm from birth complications, Wilhelm learned to hide his disability beneath carefully tailored uniforms. His relationship with his British mother was fraught, and he seemed driven to prove himself worthy of his heritage. He dismissed Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unity, in 1890, declaring he would be his own chancellor. Wilhelm's greatest obsession: beating his British cousins at their own game. He launched a naval arms race that in some years consumed around a fifth of Germany's budget, building a high seas fleet designed for one purpose: challenging the Royal Navy. The British called it the luxury fleet because it served no clear strategic purpose except prestige. Here's what makes the tragedy even more bitter. Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas actually exchanged urgent telegrams in the final days, even as mobilization timetables took control away from both emperors. Willie and Nicky, as they called each other, watched helplessly as their war machines lurched into motion. Because in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was drowning in his own weakness. This gentle, loving father never wanted to be emperor. He'd rather have been a country gentleman, playing with his children and collecting stamps. But history had other plans. Nicholas's empire was a powder keg wrapped in gold leaf. Industrial workers in St. Petersburg lived in overcrowded, disease-ridden slums. Although Stolypin's reforms had allowed some peasants to buy land, millions still worked fields they could never truly call their own. His military had been humiliated by Japan, white Europeans beaten by an Asian power for the first time in centuries. The revolution of 1905 had forced him to grant a Duma, though he retained sweeping autocratic powers. And then there was the Rasputin problem. The mad monk had insinuated himself into the royal family through his ability to stop the bleeding episodes of Nicholas's hemophiliac son, Alexei. Alexandra, the Tsar's German-born wife, believed Rasputin was sent by God. The Russian people believed he was the devil himself, corrupting their monarchy with his wild eyes and unwashed beard. But here's what terrified German generals. Russia was getting stronger every day. The Trans-Siberian Railway was nearly complete. Russian industry had surged dramatically after 1905. Military reforms were transforming the army that had collapsed against Japan. The army's great program aimed at immense strength by 1917. German staff assessments suggested they had maybe 5 years before Russia became unbeatable. The clock was ticking. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph ruled an empire held together by habit and Habsburg bureaucracy. He'd survived 66 years on the throne by outlasting everyone who opposed him. But fate had been cruel to the old emperor. His son Rudolf had blown his brains out in a suicide pact with his teenage mistress. His wife Elizabeth had been stabbed through the heart by an anarchist in Geneva. His brother Maximilian had faced a Mexican firing squad. Austria-Hungary wasn't a country. It was a controlled explosion of competing nationalisms. Multiple languages echoed through government buildings. Czechs plotted independence in Prague coffeehouses. Southern Slavs looked across the border to Serbia with hungry eyes. The empire existed because nobody could agree on how to carve up what many saw as a dying realm. And the arms race? It had become pure madness. Between 1908 and 1913, European military spending exploded by roughly 50%. Germany expanded its army from 600,000 to around 800,000 men. France's 1913 three-year service law forced every young man to serve longer, creating a generation trained for war. Russia's great program planned to field massive armies that would dwarf anything Europe had seen. The naval race was even more insane. Britain's HMS Dreadnought had made every existing battleship obsolete overnight, triggering a frantic scramble to build bigger, deadlier floating fortresses. Each new dreadnought cost millions of pounds, vast sums for ships that would rarely leave harbour. Most would spend the war safely anchored, too valuable to risk in actual combat. But the most dangerous delusion of all? Every general, every admiral, every politician believed the next war would be short. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Modern firepower was too devastating for anything longer. Industrial economies couldn't survive the disruption. Everyone would be home by Christmas, with victory parades and medals. In early summer 1914, tourists packed luxury hotels in Baden-Baden and Monte Carlo. Artists debated cubism in Parisian cafes. The future glittered with promise. None could imagine that within months, poison gas would turn battlefields into scenes from hell. That machine guns would murder entire battalions in a single afternoon. That in the early years, generals would send men walking into murderous fire until tactics slowly, bloodily evolved. The golden age was about to end with a gunshot in Sarajevo, and the world would never be innocent again. June 28th, 1914. Sarajevo, a city where empires collided and conspiracies bred in smoky coffeehouses. Gavrilo Princip sat near Moritz Schiller's delicatessen, staring at his unfinished sandwich. The 19-year-old Serbian nationalist should have been celebrating, or fleeing. Instead, he was contemplating failure. The assassination plot had been perfect on paper. The Black Hand, Serbia's secret terrorist organization, had spent months planning the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. 6 assassins positioned along the motorcade route. Bombs and pistols distributed. The target, a man whose death would supposedly liberate Bosnia's Slavs from Habsburg rule. But the morning had been a disaster. The first assassin, Mehmed Mehmedbašić, had lost his nerve and melted into the crowd. The second, Nedeljko Čabrinović, had hurled his bomb at the Archduke's car, but the explosive struck the folded roof and bounced into the street, detonating under the following vehicle. Count Buswaldeck and several spectators were wounded in the blast. Čabrinović swallowed his cyanide pill and leaped into the river Miljacka. The poison was old and weak. The river was 4 inches deep. He was immediately captured, vomiting and humiliated. Franz Ferdinand, remarkably, insisted the planned visit continue. His wife Sophie, the Duchess of Hohenberg, begged him to leave. But the Archduke was stubborn and perhaps braver than anyone realized. "The fellow must be insane," he muttered about Čabrinović, brushing glass fragments from his uniform. Here's the historical irony that makes the tragedy even more bitter. Franz Ferdinand was probably Austria, Hungary's best hope for peace. Unlike the old emperor and the war hawks in Vienna, the Archduke favored reform over repression. He wanted to grant Slavs more autonomy within the empire, exactly what the assassins claimed to want. His death would eliminate the one man who might have prevented the war they were about to unleash. After the bomb attack, the motorcade route was hastily changed. Instead of continuing down the planned path where the remaining assassins waited, the cars would take a different street to visit the wounded officer in the hospital. Princip, and the other conspirators abandoned their positions, assuming the mission had failed. This is where fate intervened with cruel precision. The Archduke's driver, Leopold Lodgka, hadn't been informed of the route change. As the motorcade approached Franz Joseph Street, the provincial governor sitting beside him suddenly realized the mistake. "Stop," he shouted. "We're going the wrong way." Lodgka slammed on the brakes. The car stalled. As he struggled to restart the engine and reverse direction, the vehicle came to a complete stop, directly in front of Moritz Schiller's delicatessen. Gavrilo Princip looked up from his position and couldn't believe his eyes. The man he'd been sent to kill was sitting motionless, barely 5 feet away. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie sat in the open, convertible like targets in a shooting gallery. Princip stood up, stepped forward, and drew his Belgian FN Model 1910 pistol. The first shot struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second hit Sophie in the abdomen. Both bullets were fired from point-blank range. "Sophil! Sophil!" the Archduke gasped as blood poured from his mouth. "Don't die. Stay alive for our children." Those were among his last coherent words. The Duchess of Hohenberg was already dead, slumped over her husband's lap. Within minutes, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire had joined her. Bystanders immediately tackled Princip before he could turn the gun on himself. Whether he attempted to swallow his cyanide capsule or was restrained too quickly remains debated, but like Chabrinovich, he was captured alive. As police dragged him away, the crowd screamed for his blood. Some shouted, "Kill the Serb." Others simply wept. The assassin was just 19, too young for the death penalty under Austrian law. He weighed barely 100 pounds and suffered from tuberculosis. This sickly teenager had just murdered the heir to the throne and his wife, parents of 3 young children. He had lit the fuse that would detonate the modern world. The news reached Vienna by telegraph within hours. Emperor Franz Joseph received the report with stoic grief, another family tragedy in a reign marked by personal losses. But his advisors saw opportunity in catastrophe. General Konrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of staff who had advocated war with Serbia 25 times in 2 years, finally had his justification. In Belgrade, the Serbian government panicked. They knew the Black Hand operated from their territory. They knew Austrian rage would demand satisfaction. Prime Minister Nikola Pasic had even tried to warn Vienna that something was planned, but his vague diplomatic warnings had been ignored. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas received the news with genuine sorrow. He had liked Franz Ferdinand personally and understood his loss to the cause of peace. But Russia could not abandon Serbia. The Orthodox Slavs looked to the Tsar as their protector. Honor and politics demanded support for their Balkan ally. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm was aboard his yacht in the Baltic when the telegram arrived. Now or never, his generals had told him for years. The Schlieffen Plan required immediate action if Russia began to mobilize. Delay meant facing a 2-front war with no hope of victory. What followed was 28 days of diplomatic madness. Austria-Hungary consulted with Germany and received the infamous blank check, complete support for whatever action Vienna deemed necessary. On July 23rd, the Austrians delivered an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh it was designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted 8 of the 10 demands, but balked at allowing Austrian police to operate on Serbian soil. It wasn't enough. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russian mobilization followed. German mobilization followed that. France honored its alliance with Russia. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain honored its guarantee of Belgian neutrality. Each step seemed logical, even inevitable, to the leaders taking it. None intended to start a world war. Each believed they were responding defensively to the aggression of others. Yet collectively they were sleepwalking into catastrophe. In his prison cell in Theresienstadt, Gavrilo Princip would live to witness much of the destruction his bullets had unleashed. Millions of casualties, empires crumbling, the map of Europe being redrawn in blood. He died of tuberculosis in April 1918, just months before the armistice, unrepentant to the last. The wrong turn on Franz Joseph Street had lasted only moments. It changed the course of human history forever. Within 28 days, the lights would go out across Europe, and when they came on again, the world would never be the same. August 1st, 1914. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm signed the mobilization order that would destroy his empire. Germany was about to bet everything on the most audacious military gamble in human history. Here's the mind-bending part. The plan was actually brilliant. Count Alfred von Schlieffen had spent 9 years obsessing over Germany's impossible puzzle. How do you fight Russia and France simultaneously when either one alone could destroy you? His answer was so audacious, it bordered on madness. Don't fight them simultaneously. Fight them sequentially. Schlieffen's math was terrifyingly simple. Russia needed 6 weeks to mobilize its massive army. France could be crushed in 5. Margin for error, 7 days. It was like performing brain surgery with a stopwatch. The plan required violating Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by Britain since 1839. German leaders knew this risked British intervention, but calculated that France would fall before Britain could intervene effectively. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost Germany everything. On his deathbed in 1906, Schlieffen had whispered his final words, "Keep the right wing strong." It was like a dying curse. His successor, Helmuth von Moltke, the younger, nephew of the great Moltke, who had crushed France in 1870, immediately began weakening that right wing. He was about to discover why you don't modify a master's final wishes. August 4th. German jackboots crossed into Belgium. What happened next shocked even the Germans. Belgium, a country smaller than West Virginia, told the German Empire to go to hell. King Albert, all of 5 feet 6 inches tall, stood up to the Kaiser's million-man army. Belgium is a nation, not a road, his government declared. It was a death sentence disguised as diplomacy. The fortress city of Liège was supposed to fall in 2 days. Instead, 30,000 Belgian soldiers held off 120,000 Germans for nearly 2 weeks. Those crucial days gave Britain time to land troops, France time to reposition forces, and Russia time to mobilize faster than German planners had calculated. But the real catastrophe for Germany wasn't military, it was moral. German soldiers, trained for quick victory, found themselves fighting house to house against Belgian civilians. Panic set in. Reports flew of franc-tireurs, civilian snipers supposedly shooting from windows and church towers. Most were imaginary, but terrified German troops began seeing enemies everywhere. The massacres that followed were methodical and horrifying. In Dinant, German soldiers lined up 644 civilians against a wall and shot them execution style. Among the dead, infants barely weeks old. In Louvain, they burned the medieval university library, 300,000 books and manuscripts, some dating back 1,000 years, reduced to ash in a single night. German High Command had approved harsh policies of frightfulness to terrorize civilian populations into submission. Local commanders, operating under stress and fear, often interpreted these orders with deadly results. What they didn't anticipate was the global reaction. British propaganda turned Belgian atrocities into recruitment gold. Posters showing German soldiers bayoneting babies were crude exaggerations, but close enough to reality to be believed. American newspapers, initially neutral, began calling Germans Huns. The violation of Belgian neutrality had handed the Allies the moral high ground on a silver platter. Germany had won battles but lost the propaganda war before it had properly begun. Meanwhile, France was committing suicide by stupidity. Plan 17 was French military thinking at its most catastrophically romantic. General Ferdinand Foch, the future Supreme Allied Commander, actually taught that superior will could overcome modern firepower. In the next war, he'd lectured, the victory will belong to the side which attacks. He was about to test that theory with French blood. French soldiers marched to war in bright red trousers and blue coats that could be seen from miles away. When military officials suggested camouflage, War Minister Adolphe Mesemy exploded, "Eliminate the red trousers! Never! Red trousers are France!" French fashion was about to meet German machine guns. The Battle of the Frontiers lasted 5 days. In those 5 days, France lost approximately 300,000 men, more casualties than America would suffer in many of its major conflicts combined. Entire regiments wiped out in minutes as they charged across open fields toward entrenched German positions. Plan 17 died, choking on its own blood. But the most shocking moment came when Britain honoured its guarantee of Belgian neutrality. The British Expeditionary Force was the best army in the world, 120,000 professional soldiers who could shoot 15 rounds per minute with deadly accuracy. Kaiser Wilhelm had sneered at Britain's contemptible little army. Those words would become the BEF's badge of honour. They called themselves the Old Contemptibles and wore the insult like a medal. At Mons on August 23rd, reality met theory head-on. British rifle fire was so rapid and accurate that German troops reported facing massed machine guns. They weren't entirely wrong. A British soldier could fire faster than some machine guns. But there were only 2 British divisions against 4 German corps. Math eventually won. The retreat from Mons became legendary. For 14 days, British soldiers fought rearguard actions under blazing August heat. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their feet bleeding through worn-out boots. Later, some would claim supernatural intervention, the famous Angels of Mons, though these visions likely reflected exhaustion and the trauma of retreat. But they kept fighting, kept retreating, kept bleeding the German advance. By early September, German forces had advanced to within 30 miles of Paris. Panic gripped the capital. The government fled to Bordeaux like rats, abandoning a sinking ship. Rich Parisians loaded carriages with jewelry and fled south. Poor Parisians prepared to fight in the streets. Then came the miracle that saved France. General Joseph Joffre, a man so calm under pressure that he never missed his afternoon nap, even during the crisis, had been secretly assembling a new army east of Paris. British reconnaissance aircraft spotted something incredible. A 30-mile gap had opened between the German First and Second Armies. It was like finding a crack in a seemingly impenetrable wall. On September 6th, Joffre launched the counterattack that would echo through history. "The hour has come," he telegraphed his commanders, "to advance at all costs, and to die where you stand rather than give way." It was France's desperate last stand. The most famous moment, 600 Paris taxis rushing troops to the front, was actually a tiny part of the battle, carrying about 6,000 men out of hundreds of thousands engaged. But the image was perfect, civilization itself, grabbing whatever weapons it could find to fight the German war machine. Cab drivers who'd never held a rifle became symbols of French resistance. For 3 days, the fate of France hung by a thread. Over 500,000 men clashed along a front, stretching from Verdun to the outskirts of Paris. Casualties mounted by the tens of thousands as both armies reached the breaking point. Then German General Karl von Bülow blinked first. Fearing his Second Army was about to be surrounded, he ordered a retreat. Moltke, 70 miles away and completely out of touch, panicked and ordered a general withdrawal. The Schlieffen Plan, 9 years in the making, died in a moment of terror. Paris was saved, but at a staggering cost. Over 500,000 Franco-British casualties, 300,000 German. In 6 weeks of fighting, Europe had bled more than most wars produced in years. As autumn rain began to fall, exhausted armies dug trenches along the River Aisne. What started as temporary shelter became a 400-mile scar across Europe. The war of movement was over. The war of industrial slaughter was about to begin. Germany's brilliant gamble had failed by exactly the margin Schlieffen had calculated 8 years earlier. Instead of victory in 6 weeks, they faced the nightmare of a two-front war stretching into an unknown future. After Britain declared war, German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg would bitterly tell the British ambassador that Britain was going to war over a scrap of paper, the Belgian Neutrality Treaty. That scrap of paper had just cost Germany the war. The old world was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. September 1914. After the carnage of the Marne, something unprecedented happened along the River Aisne. Exhausted soldiers began digging holes in the ground to escape the killing fire above. They called them temporary defensive positions. They would become permanent graves for a generation. Field fortifications weren't new. Armies had used them in the Crimea and the American Civil War. But nothing had prepared anyone for this scale. Trenches evolved like a virus, spreading along the Western Front as both armies discovered that any man who showed his head above ground level died instantly. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute with lethal effect, at ranges that made traditional attacks suicidal. Artillery shells could kill at distances measured in miles. The only safe place was underground. What started as individual foxholes became communication trenches. Communication trenches became elaborate networks. Networks became underground cities stretching from the Swiss border to the English Channel. 475 miles of human misery carved into the earth. Both armies raced north, trying to outflank each other in what historians call the race to the sea. Each leapfrogging movement ended the same way: more trenches, more barbed wire, more machine gun nests. At Ypres in Belgium, the British made their final desperate stand to prevent a German breakthrough to the Channel ports. The First Battle of Ypres lasted from October to November 1914. German troops, many of them university students who had volunteered in patriotic fervor, marched across open fields singing Die Wacht am Rhein. British machine gunners cut them down by the thousands. Germans called it the Kindermord, the massacre of the innocents. The losses among Germany's educated youth were catastrophic, though the universities would survive to mourn their dead. By November, the line was complete. Two parallel systems of trenches faced each other across a wasteland called No Man's Land. Between them, barbed wire, shell craters, and the unburied dead of 4 months of slaughter. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. Then, on Christmas Eve 1914, something miraculous happened. It started with singing. German soldiers in trenches near Ypres began caroling Still Nacht, Silent Night. British troops, shivering in waterlogged trenches just yards away, heard the familiar melody and began singing along in English. French soldiers added their voices with Douce Nuit. For a brief moment, No Man's Land echoed with harmony instead of gunfire. What happened next defied every military regulation in every army manual. Soldiers began climbing out of their trenches. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. Men who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier met in the middle of No Man's Land to shake hands and exchange Christmas greetings. The Christmas truce wasn't universal. It happened sporadically along the line, often against direct orders from officers. In some sectors, soldiers exchanged cigarettes and chocolate. In others, they showed each other photographs of wives and children back home. Near Frelinghin, British and German soldiers actually played football, using empty bully beef cans as goalposts. Accounts of the final score vary, but the Germans claimed victory in what may have been history's most surreal sporting event. Private Alfred Dugan Chater of the Gordon Highlanders wrote to his mother, "I can hardly believe that I have been in the trenches for 5 days and have never fired a shot. The Germans are really quite decent fellows." German soldier Gustav Riebensam wrote in his diary, "How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was." The English officers felt the same way about it. The truce couldn't last. By December 26th, artillery shells were falling again. Officers on both sides, horrified by the fraternization, issued strict orders that any repetition would be treated as treason. Some sectors attempted smaller truces in 1915 and 1916, but never again would enemies meet so openly in friendship. The Christmas truce of 1914 became humanity's last gasp before the abyss. While the Western Front congealed into static horror, the Eastern Front exploded into catastrophic movement. Russia had mobilized faster than anyone expected. 2 massive armies, the First Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf and the Second Army under General Alexander Samsonov invaded East Prussia in August. Their mission: draw German troops away from the attack on France and strike at the heart of Prussia itself. The Russian steamroller looked unstoppable. Nearly 500,000 men advanced on two fronts, supported by cavalry and artillery. German defenders numbered barely 200,000. Panic gripped Berlin as Russian Cossacks raided deep into German territory. Kaiser Wilhelm demanded reinforcements be sent from France immediately. Instead, two officers were given command of the Eighth Army, General Paul von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff, Erich Ludendorff. Hindenburg was 67 years old, recalled from comfortable retirement to face the Russian menace. Tall, imposing, with a granite face and steely blue eyes, he looked like a Prussian general from central casting. While his Chief of Staff provided the operational brilliance, Hindenburg brought steady nerves and sound judgment when decisions had to be made under extreme pressure. Erich Ludendorff was everything traditional Prussian officers weren't: brilliant, ruthless, and risen through merit rather than birth. The son of a minor merchant, he had clawed his way up by sheer ability. Where Hindenburg provided calm leadership, Ludendorff provided the razor-sharp intellect that would destroy armies. Their first test came at Tannenberg in late August. Russian communications were so poor that commanders sent wireless messages in clear text. No codes, no encryption. German intelligence officers couldn't believe their luck as they intercepted detailed Russian battle plans, troop movements, and timetables. It was like playing poker with your opponent's cards face up. Ludendorff devised a plan of breathtaking audacity. Using East Prussia's excellent railway network, he would concentrate the entire German Eighth Army against Samsonov's Second Army, while holding off Rennenkampf with minimal forces. If it worked, they could destroy one Russian army before the other could intervene. If it failed, Russian armies would converge on the Germans from two directions and annihilate them. The Battle of Tannenberg lasted 4 days. When it ended, an entire Russian army had ceased to exist. 92,000 prisoners marched into German captivity. 50,000 more lay dead in the forests of East Prussia. General Samsonov, overwhelmed by the catastrophe, wandered into the woods and shot himself. A week later, at the Masurian Lakes, Hindenburg and Ludendorff repeated their performance against Rennenkampf. Casualties estimates vary, but somewhere between 60 and 100,000 more Russians were killed, wounded, or captured. Another army shattered. In 2 weeks, Russia had lost more men than Germany had fielded in the entire East Prussian campaign. The victories made Hindenburg and Ludendorff national heroes overnight. Germans, desperate for good news after the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, elevated them to mythic status. Hindenburg became the savior of East Prussia. Wooden statues of him appeared in town squares, where citizens could drive nails into them for war bonds. The bigger the donation, the bigger the nail. But the Eastern Front victories came with a hidden cost. Success bred ambition. Hindenburg and Ludendorff began demanding more troops, more resources, more authority. They started viewing themselves as Germany's indispensable men. By 1916, they would effectively control German strategy, while Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg retained the formal title, but lost real power. As 1914 ended, the war had already exceeded every prediction. The Western Front was frozen in trenches that would barely move for 4 years. The Eastern Front had swallowed armies whole. Millions were already dead or wounded. But this was just the beginning. The earth had opened up to swallow a generation, and it was still hungry. By the end of 1914, warfare had been transformed into something unprecedented in human history. The old rules were dying along with the men who had written them. The machine gun was the supreme arbiter of this new battlefield. The Maxim gun, invented by American Hiram Maxim in 1884, could fire 500 rounds per minute without pause. One gun could do the work of 50 riflemen. 2 guns positioned correctly could stop an entire battalion. But generals on both sides had trained for the previous war, not this one. They believed in the power of human courage to overcome mechanical death. French doctrine still preached the mystical power of élan vital, the offensive spirit that could conquer any obstacle through sheer willpower. British officers had studied colonial wars, where brave men with rifles had charged native positions and won. German tacticians trusted in discipline and superior training. None had reckoned with the simple mathematics of modern firepower. A well-positioned Maxim gun could cut down hundreds of attacking infantry in minutes. Attacking soldiers, no matter how brave, how well trained, how perfectly motivated, moved at 3 miles per hour across open ground. Machine gun bullets traveled at 2,000 feet per second. Courage became irrelevant when mathematics governed the battlefield. The slaughter at Ypres had proven this beyond doubt. German volunteers, many of them university students, had advanced into machine gun fire singing patriotic songs. They died bravely, but they still died. British regulars had attacked German positions with parade ground precision and been cut down like wheat before a scythe. Yet somehow, military commanders convinced themselves that the solution was more men, not different tactics. If 1,000 men couldn't break through, then send 2,000. If 2,000 failed, send 5,000. Human waves became the standard answer to mechanical firepower. The result was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Battles that in previous wars might have cost hundreds of casualties now consumed thousands in a single afternoon. The mathematics were becoming clear. Modern weapons had made frontal assault a form of mass suicide. But if conventional weapons had made war more deadly, science was about to make it diabolic. Poison gas had been banned by the Hague Convention of 1899. Every civilized nation had agreed that chemical weapons were too horrible for warfare between Christian peoples. But by 1914, civilization was breaking down along with everything else. German chemists, led by Fritz Haber, were developing something far more sinister than conventional explosives. Chlorine gas was a byproduct of German chemical industry, abundant, cheap, and lethally effective. Heavier than air, it would sink into trenches and shell holes where soldiers took shelter. It attacked the respiratory system, drowning victims in their own fluids as their lungs filled with foam. The Germans had already experimented with tear gas shells on the Eastern Front, but these were relatively harmless irritants. What Haber was developing was something far worse, true chemical warfare designed to kill, not merely inconvenience. German scientists were perverting their knowledge, turning chemistry from a tool of progress into an instrument of torture. Haber's wife Clara, herself a chemist, would later take her own life with her husband's service pistol. Whether her suicide was connected to his chemical warfare research remains debated by historians. But the symbolism was unmistakable. Science itself was committing suicide. Meanwhile, a new form of warfare was emerging beneath the waves. The submarine, Unterseeboot in German, U-boat for short, represented a revolution in naval warfare as profound as the machine gun had been on land. These steel sharks could attack without warning, strike from invisible positions, and disappear beneath the waves before their victims could respond. On September 5, 1914, HMS Pathfinder became the first warship in history sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. U-21 put a single torpedo into the British cruiser, which exploded and sank in 4 minutes with the loss of 259 lives. The age of underwater warfare had begun. 3 weeks later, U-9 achieved something even more shocking. In the space of 1 hour, a single German submarine sank 3 British cruisers, HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue, and HMS Cressy. 1,400 British sailors died that morning, victims of a weapon most naval officers still considered unsporting. But the U-boats represented more than just a new weapon. They represented a new kind of warfare that would blur the line between soldier and civilian. Britain depended on imported food to feed its population. Germany was beginning to realize that submarines could starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships carrying grain from America. The implications were staggering. For centuries, naval warfare had followed established rules. Warships fought warships. Merchant vessels were searched before being seized. Civilian passengers were allowed to escape in lifeboats. Submarines made such gentlemanly conduct nearly impossible. A U-boat that surfaced to inspect cargo became vulnerable to ramming or gunfire. This meant that merchant vessels carrying food and supplies would increasingly become targets. The distinction between combatant and civilian, already blurring on land, was about to face new challenges at sea. By winter 1914, the character of the Great War was becoming clear. Machine guns dominated the battlefield. Chemical weapons were being developed in secret laboratories. Submarines prowled the seas, ready to sink anything that moved. Science and industry were being harnessed for destruction on a scale never before imagined. Millions of men sat in trenches stretching from Switzerland to the sea, separated by a few hundred yards of wire and corpses. Behind them, the industrial might of Europe worked day and night to produce ever more efficient methods of killing. Factories that had made farm equipment now manufactured artillery shells. Chemical plants that had produced fertilizer were being converted for other purposes. Shipyards that had built luxury liners now launched submarines. The old rules of war, honor, chivalry, the protection of non-combatants, were dying along with everything else. This was becoming something new in human history, industrialized slaughter conducted by entire nations. But this was only the beginning. 1915 would teach them the true meaning of industrial killing. January 1915. Winston Churchill stared at a map and convinced himself he'd found the secret to ending World War I. One brilliant stroke that would unlock the deadlock and crown him the savior of the British Empire. Instead, he was about to create one of military history's most spectacular disasters. Churchill's plan was breathtakingly simple: smash through the Dardanelles with battleships, steam into Constantinople, and watch the Ottoman Empire collapse like a house of cards. He believed the operation could be completed quickly, telling colleagues it offered a real chance to shorten the war. It was the kind of bold thinking that had made his reputation. It was also the kind that would nearly destroy it. Here's what nobody in London properly considered: the Turks might actually fight back effectively. March 18th. The greatest naval armada since Trafalgar steamed toward the Dardanelles. 16 battleships led by HMS Queen Elizabeth, the most powerful warship on Earth. Their mission: blast through Turkish defenses, through sheer firepower. For hours, it looked like Churchill's strategy was working. Turkish batteries fell silent under torrents of 15-inch shells. Fortifications crumbled. Constantinople seemed within reach. Then the Turks played their hidden card. The Ottoman minelayer Nusret had laid 20 mines parallel to the shore just days before, undetected by Allied intelligence. The French battleship Bouvet struck one and vanished in 2 minutes with 640 souls. HMS Irresistible followed. Then HMS Ocean. In one afternoon, the Allied fleet suffered unprecedented losses to an enemy they had underestimated. Churchill's naval assault was dead. But the political momentum wouldn't let him admit defeat. If ships couldn't force the straits, then soldiers would clear the shores. What had begun as a naval demonstration was about to become a full-scale invasion. April 25th, 1915. The day that would create legends and destroy empires. At V Beach, Turkish machine gunners had perfect killing fields from the cliffs above. The converted collier SS River Clyde, packed with 2,000 British troops, ran aground as planned. As soldiers poured from sally ports cut in her sides, Turkish bullets cut them down in devastating numbers. The water around the beach was stained with blood. Bodies drifted in the shallows. But 14 miles north, at a cove that would forever bear their name, the Anzacs, Australians and New Zealanders, were writing their nation's birth certificates in blood. The landing plan called for a gentle advance across relatively flat ground at Gaba Tepe. Instead, strong currents swept the boats north to what became known as Anzac Cove, a narrow beach trapped beneath towering, scrub-covered cliffs. As dawn broke, Australian farmers and clerks found themselves in a vertical nightmare, with Turkish rifles firing down from commanding positions. There was nowhere to go but up. Commanding a key sector of the Turkish defense was 34-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal. He would later become Ataturk, father of modern Turkey. But that morning, he was an officer who understood that empires lived or died in critical moments. When Kemal spotted Australian troops climbing toward his positions, he didn't wait for orders from his superiors. He famously told his 57th Regiment, "I am not ordering you to fight, I am ordering you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other forces and commanders can come and take our place." It was a death sentence delivered with cold military logic. The regiment charged downhill and was virtually annihilated, but they bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Kemal himself was hit by shrapnel that shattered his pocket watch, probably saving his life. He carried that broken timepiece for the rest of his days, a reminder of the morning he helped save the Ottoman Empire. What followed was 8 months of trench warfare, as brutal as anything on the Western Front, but fought in Mediterranean heat. Anzac Cove became a death trap barely 500 yards deep and 1,000 yards wide. Turkish and Allied trenches were so close that soldiers could throw grenades into enemy positions. Men fought among swarms of flies, endemic dysentery, and the constant stench of decomposing corpses. In August, the Allies attempted to break the stalemate with fresh landings at Suvla Bay. British troops came ashore virtually unopposed and could have seized the commanding heights with immediate action. Victory was within their grasp. Instead, they hesitated. Officers followed cautious procedures, consolidating their beachhead rather than exploiting their advantage. While British forces dug in and established themselves methodically, Turkish reinforcements raced across the peninsula to occupy the crucial high ground. By the time the British advanced, the opportunity had vanished forever. It became a symbol of how military bureaucracy could snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. By autumn, Gallipoli had become another bloody stalemate, consuming resources and lives. Disease was killing more men than enemy bullets. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles were breaking down. Churchill had already been forced to resign from the Admiralty, his political career apparently finished. The man who had promised to shorten the war had delivered 8 months of costly stalemate. In November, the decision was made to evacuate, complete admission of failure. But if the campaign was a strategic catastrophe, the evacuation became a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated British military competence under impossible circumstances. General Sir Charles Munro planned the withdrawal with meticulous care. Troops would disappear gradually, while maintaining the illusion of normal activity. Dummy soldiers constructed from sandbags and uniforms manned trenches. Rifles rigged with dripping water cans fired automatically at irregular intervals to simulate continued occupation. The deception worked flawlessly. Over 19 nights in December 1915 and January 1916, 83,000 troops were evacuated without losing a single life to enemy action. The Turks didn't realize what was happening until the last boat disappeared over the horizon. Even Mustafa Kemal later admitted his admiration for the operation. It was the only part of the entire campaign that could be called an unqualified success. The final accounting was devastating. Approximately 250,000 Allied casualties and similar Ottoman losses, over 500,000 total. For what achievement? The Dardanelles remained closed. Russia remained isolated. The war continued exactly as before. But Gallipoli had created something else entirely, national legends that would outlast the empires that created them. The Anzac legend became foundational to Australian and New Zealand identity. Mustafa Kemal's reputation carried him to the presidency of reborn Turkey, and Churchill spent several months commanding a battalion on the Western Front before beginning his long climb back to political power. One man's strategic vision had cost 250,000 lives and achieved nothing measurable. But it had proven that in war, the distance between genius and catastrophe can be measured in underwater mines and missed opportunities. 1915. While the Western Front congealed into static horror, the Eastern Front was devouring armies whole. Russia, the empire that was supposed to steamroll Germany with sheer numbers, was bleeding to death on 2 fronts. The mathematics were becoming terrifyingly clear. Since the war began, Russia had suffered nearly 4 million casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Entire armies had simply vanished into the forests of East Prussia and the mud of Galicia. The Russian steamroller had become a Russian catastrophe. At Tannenberg and the Masurian lakes, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had shown how modern warfare could annihilate traditional armies. But those were just the opening acts. Through 1915, German and Austro-Hungarian forces drove Russian armies back hundreds of miles. Warsaw fell. Poland was lost. Russian troops retreated so far they abandoned territory the size of France. The retreat became a human catastrophe. Millions of civilians fled ahead of advancing German armies, clogging roads with ox carts, wheelbarrows, and desperate families carrying their possessions. Russian soldiers, demoralized and undersupplied, began deserting in growing numbers. Some units simply melted away as men walked home to their villages. Equipment shortages reached critical proportions. New Russian recruits often waited for rifles until veteran soldiers fell in battle. Artillery shells were so scarce that some batteries were reduced to firing just a handful per day. Against German forces firing thousands of shells per hour. General Alexei Brusilov watched this collapse with growing fury. A career cavalry officer with a white beard and piercing eyes, Brusilov understood that Russian tactics were suicidal. While other generals threw human waves against German machine guns, Brusilov began developing revolutionary new approaches. By spring 1916, the Allies were desperate. Verdun was consuming French armies. The Italians were begging for help against Austrian attacks. Russia needed to launch an offensive to relieve pressure on its allies. Most Russian generals planned another traditional assault, massed infantry charging across open ground toward prepared positions. Brusilov had a different idea. Instead of concentrating forces for a single massive attack, he would strike simultaneously along a 200-mile front. Instead of week-long artillery bombardments that warned defenders, he would use short, intense barrages followed immediately by infantry assault. Instead of frontal attacks, his troops would infiltrate enemy lines and attack strongpoints from multiple directions. It was innovative thinking that placed Brusilov among the first generals to develop modern infiltration tactics. While his colleagues were still fighting like it was 1870, he was pioneering methods that wouldn't become standard for years. June 4th, 1916. The Brusilov offensive exploded across the Austrian front. The results were spectacular. Austro-Hungarian forces, expecting the usual Russian human wave attacks, were caught completely off guard by Brusilov's sophisticated tactics. In some sectors, Russian troops advanced 60 miles in the opening weeks. Entire Austrian divisions surrendered en masse. Within days, Russia had captured 200,000 prisoners. The Austro-Hungarian army began to disintegrate. Czech and Polish units, fighting for an empire they despised, surrendered at the first opportunity. Hungarian regiments refused orders. German forces had to be rushed from Verdun to prevent total Austrian collapse, providing some relief to the French defenders. Brusilov had achieved what no Russian general had managed since the war began: decisive victory. But victory came at a price that would help destroy Russia itself. The Brusilov offensive cost Russia 500,000 casualties. Yes, they had inflicted even greater losses on Austria-Hungary. Yes, they had relieved some pressure on other fronts. But Russia was running out of more than just men. It was running out of equipment, supplies, and most critically, political will. Back in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II had already made the decision that would seal his dynasty's doom. In August 1915, with Russian armies in full retreat, Nicholas had dismissed Grand Duke Nicholas as commander-in-chief and taken personal command of the army. It seemed like strong leadership. The Tsar himself would rally Russian forces and drive back the invaders. Instead, it was political suicide. By taking command, Nicholas tied his personal prestige directly to military performance. Every defeat became his defeat. Every retreat became his retreat. Every casualty list bore his personal responsibility. The Tsar had made himself the scapegoat for Russia's military disasters. Worse, his decision left the capital in the hands of his wife Alexandra and her advisor, the mystic Grigory Rasputin. Alexandra was German-born and deeply unpopular. Rasputin was a drunken peasant who claimed mystical powers to heal the Tsar's hemophiliac son. Together, they became symbols of everything wrong with the Russian monarchy. While Nicholas played soldier at army headquarters, breadlines formed in Petrograd. While he issued optimistic bulletins about future victories, workers went on strike in armaments factories. While he maintained the facade of imperial authority, his empire was collapsing beneath him. The Brusilov offensive had been Russia's last great military success. It had helped ease pressure on Verdun, crippled Austria-Hungary, and demonstrated that Russian forces could still fight brilliantly under competent leadership. But it had also consumed precious reserves of Russian manpower and morale at a time when both were running critically low. By late 1916, cracks in Russian military discipline were becoming visible. Desertion rates climbed steadily. Officers reported growing insubordination. Revolutionary propaganda began spreading through the ranks. Russia still had millions of men under arms, but their willingness to fight was evaporating. The Tsar, who had taken personal command to save his army, had instead doomed his throne. By tying his fate to military success, he had guaranteed that military failure would mean political catastrophe. Russia had bled white on two fronts, and the man responsible sat in army headquarters, still believing he could win a war his empire could no longer afford to fight. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder that consumed not just armies but empires themselves. And 1917 would prove that even the mightiest throne could not survive when the grinding finally stopped. April 22nd, 1915. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Near the Belgian town of Ypres, German soldiers opened the valves on 5,000 steel cylinders. A yellow-green cloud began drifting across no man's land on the spring breeze. It was the moment chemical warfare became mass murder. The Germans had experimented with tear gas and irritants before, but this was different. Chlorine gas, the same chemical used to purify drinking water, was about to become an instrument of death. Fritz Haber had convinced German high command that chemical weapons could break the deadlock of trench warfare. The faster we can terrorize the enemy, the sooner this war will end. French colonial troops, Algerians and Moroccans, holding the line north of Ypres, saw the strange cloud approaching and assumed it was a smokescreen. Then the wind shifted, and the gas settled into their trenches like fog from a nightmare. Chlorine attacks the respiratory system with chemical precision. It reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid, essentially burning victims from the inside. Men began choking, gasping, clawing at their throats as their lungs filled with bloody foam. Those who couldn't run fast enough drowned in their own fluids while standing upright. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Thousands of troops abandoned their positions in panic. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line. German infantry, wearing primitive gas masks, advanced through the yellow cloud toward objectives they had only dreamed of reaching. But the Germans weren't prepared for their own success. They had brought insufficient reserves to exploit the breakthrough. Many of their own troops were terrified of advancing through the lingering gas clouds. By evening, Canadian forces had rushed to fill the gap, and the opportunity was lost. The Second Battle of Ypres had introduced industrial-scale chemical warfare, but it would take months to perfect the technique. Initial German gas masks were crude affairs, cotton pads soaked in chemical solutions. Allied troops improvised protection by urinating on handkerchiefs and pressing them over their faces. The ammonia provided some defense against chlorine. Within weeks, both sides were manufacturing proper gas masks and developing new chemical weapons. The arms race had entered a new dimension of horror. What had begun as an experiment in terror was becoming standard military practice. But poison gas was only one front in Germany's expanding war on civilization. Beneath the waves, German U-boats were about to cross a line that would shock the world. May 7th, 1915. 11 miles off the coast of Ireland. The RMS Lusitania was completing her 101st Atlantic crossing. The fastest passenger liner in the world. She carried 1,962 passengers and crew from New York to Liverpool. Among them were wealthy Americans, British businessmen, families with children, and infants in their mothers' arms. Captain William Turner had received warnings about U-boat activity in Irish waters. The German embassy had even published advertisements in American newspapers, warning passengers not to travel on British ships. But the Lusitania was fast, faster than any submarine, and her passengers felt secure in British naval supremacy. U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, had been patrolling Irish waters for 6 days. His orders were clear: sink any enemy vessel without warning. The distinction between warship and passenger liner was a luxury Germany could no longer afford. At 2:10 in the afternoon, Schwieger spotted the massive liner through his periscope. 4 funnels and 2 masts of a steamer, he wrote in his log. The Lusitania was traveling at reduced speed in a straight line, a perfect target. Schwieger fired a single torpedo from 700 meters. The torpedo struck the starboard side just below the bridge. The explosion was followed immediately by a second, much larger blast. The cause remains debated to this day. The Lusitania began listing severely to starboard, making it impossible to launch most of the lifeboats. 18 minutes. That's how long it took for the pride of the Cunard Line to disappear beneath the waves. Passengers who had been enjoying lunch found themselves fighting for their lives in the frigid Atlantic. Mothers held their babies above the water until their strength failed. Children separated from parents cried for help that would never come. When rescue ships arrived, they pulled 764 survivors from the water. 1,198 souls had perished, including 128 Americans. Among the dead were millionaire Alfred Vanderbilt, playwright Charles Frohman, and dozens of children whose only crime was crossing the ocean with their families. The reaction in America was explosive. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Mass murder on the high seas." Editorial cartoons showed German submarines attacking baby carriages. Former President Theodore Roosevelt called it piracy on a scale of murder. Recruiting stations saw long lines of angry young Americans demanding to enlist, though America wasn't yet at war. But President Woodrow Wilson faced an impossible choice. Public opinion demanded action, but America was unprepared for war. The US Army numbered just 98,000 men, smaller than many European divisions. The Navy was powerful but scattered across 2 oceans. Wilson chose diplomacy over war, sending increasingly stern notes to Berlin demanding Germany abandon unrestricted submarine warfare. His famous phrase, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight," satisfied neither hawks nor doves. Americans began to realize their president was trying to preserve neutrality in a world where neutrality was becoming impossible. Germany, shocked by the international reaction, temporarily restricted submarine attacks on passenger ships. But the precedent had been set. Modern warfare was erasing the distinction between combatant and civilian, between soldier and passenger, between military target and innocent victim. Back in Germany, Fritz Haber was promoted and honored for his chemical weapons work. His wife Clara, overwhelmed by personal and professional pressures, including her husband's role in chemical warfare, shot herself with his service pistol in their garden. Even those closest to the architects of modern warfare couldn't escape its moral weight. The chlorine clouds of Ypres and the torpedo that sank the Lusitania marked a turning point in human warfare. Science, industry, and military strategy had combined to create new forms of mass killing. The rules of civilized warfare, protection of non-combatants, prohibition of chemical weapons, safe passage for neutral vessels, were dying along with everything else. By the end of 1915, over 5 million men were dead or missing. Poison gas was becoming routine. Submarine warfare threatened to expand the conflict across every ocean. America was edging toward the abyss, though most Americans didn't yet realize it. The old world's last illusions about civilized warfare had drowned with the Lusitania and died in the gas clouds of Ypres. War was no longer between armies. It was between entire populations, entire civilizations, entire ways of life. But 1916 would dwarf all previous slaughter. The year when humanity learned to industrialize death itself. February 21st, 1916. 4:15 in the morning. What happened next was so loud it shattered windows in villages 50 miles away and drove farm animals insane with terror. In the opening day, German guns fired roughly 1 million shells at Verdun, 1 shell for every 2 people living in the city. The barrage carried for miles across eastern France. Trees weren't just cut down, they were atomized into sawdust. Hills disappeared. Human beings were vaporized so completely that families never found enough remains to bury. But here's the twisted genius of General Erich von Falkenhayn's plan. he didn't want to capture Verdun. He wanted to use it as bait in the most calculating mass murder scheme in military history. Falkenhayn had done the math. Germany couldn't win through breakthrough. The Western Front was too strong. But Germany could win by turning warfare into an accounting problem. Find a place France would defend at any cost, then make that cost higher than France could afford to pay. Verdun was perfect psychological warfare. The fortress city was ancient, symbolic, sacred to French national pride. More importantly, it stuck out into German lines like a thumb begging to be chopped off. Falkenhayn could attack from 3 sides, while France could only supply it through one road under constant German observation. A rationale he later advanced, debated by historians, was bleeding France white, Falkenhayn would claim. It wasn't a battle plan, it was a business model. Germany would use superior firepower and logistics to create a human meat grinder that consumed French divisions faster than they could be replaced. The bombardment worked beyond German nightmares. French positions didn't just get destroyed, they were erased from existence. Communication lines vaporized. Officers lost contact with their men and assumed everyone was dead. Some French units were buried alive and had to dig themselves out of their own graves. But small groups of French soldiers survived in impossible places: cellars, tunnels, shell holes filled with corpses. When German infantry advanced, expecting to find empty trenches, machine gun fire erupted from positions that should have been obliterated. What should have been a victory parade became a 10-month descent into hell. General Philippe Pétain arrived to take command on February 25th and immediately realized he was managing an apocalypse. Verdun was connected to France by the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, a single road that had to carry everything: ammunition, food, reinforcements, hope itself. Here's the insane part. Pétain organized a conveyor belt of human misery that actually worked. Truck convoys ran day and night along the sacred way, bringing fresh troops forward and hauling broken men back. No French division stayed at Verdun long enough to be completely destroyed. They rotated in for weeks of hell, then rotated out for psychological recovery. It was like feeding logs into a furnace. Each unit burned, but the fire never went out. By the battle's end, the great majority of French divisions had rotated through Verdun. Almost every French family would receive a letter from hell. The Germans called it the Blutmühle, the blood mill. French soldiers called it l'enfer, hell. Both names were understatements. Fort Douaumont, supposedly impregnable, fell to German assault troops in February because most of its garrison had been pulled out for service elsewhere. 10 German soldiers captured the strongest fortress in Europe by walking through an unlocked door. Sometimes the most sophisticated defenses fail for the most ridiculous reasons. But losing Douaumont only made France more insane with determination. General Robert Nivelle issued the order that would define French national character: "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. It wasn't just military strategy, it was a suicide pact with national honor. What followed defied human description. Men lived in shell holes filled with decomposing bodies and rats the size of cats. They drank water, contaminated with human remains. They ate food crawling with maggots, because maggots meant the food was still technically organic matter. Private Paul Truffaut wrote to his wife, "Humanity is mad." It must be mad to do what it is doing. What a massacre! What scenes of horror and carnage! Hell cannot be so terrible. A German shell killed him 2 days later, probably while he was eating his morning ration of maggoty bread. Here's a detail that sounds fictional but isn't. Soldiers developed a condition called burial shock from being buried alive repeatedly by collapsing trenches. Men would dig themselves out of one collapse, only to be buried by the next shell. Some spent entire days underground, clawing through dirt and corpses to reach air. The weather joined the assault on human sanity. Winter rain turned shell holes into ice-rimmed pools, where wounded men drowned before they could be rescued. Spring mud was so deep that stretcher-bearers sometimes disappeared completely, swallowed by the earth along with the wounded they were trying to save. Summer heat made the stench of decomposing bodies so intense that men vomited from the smell alone. Mort Homme, Dead Man's Hill, changed hands 16 times. Each attack left more bodies on its slopes until the hill was literally built from human remains. The village of Fleury was captured and recaptured 17 times. By battle's end, aerial photographs showed nothing but crater marks where a community had once existed. The psychological toll created its own horror stories. Soldiers developed the 1,000-yard stare, empty eyes that had seen too much death to process. Some went catatonic, standing motionless in trenches until shells killed them. Others developed hysterical mutism. They could no longer speak, could only point and grunt and weep. Medical facilities became scenes from Dante's nightmares. Doctors amputated limbs by candlelight in underground bunkers, while shells exploded overhead. When anesthetics ran out, surgeons held men down and sawed off shattered limbs while patients screamed. Hospital trains arrived in Paris, carrying men who had aged 20 years in 20 days. By summer, Falkenhayn's accounting was working exactly as planned. France was hemorrhaging entire generations into the Verdun meat grinder. German casualties were heavy, but French losses were mathematically unsustainable. The French army was being bled white, division by division, exactly as predicted. Then something beautiful happened. Britain launched the Battle of the Somme. Suddenly, Germany faced pressure on 2 fronts. Falkenhayn had to choose between continuing his war of attrition at Verdun or defending against British attacks elsewhere. The master of calculating slaughter couldn't calculate his way out of fighting 2 battles simultaneously. He chose to reduce pressure on Verdun. French forces, using tactics developed through months of surviving hell, launched counteroffensives in October and November. They recaptured Fort Douaumont and most lost territory. By December, the front had stabilized roughly where it started. The accounting was staggering. 10 months of fighting for essentially no territorial change. 700,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, French and German combined. Some French villages lost every male between the ages of 16 and 50. German families received death notices by the trainload. But here's the most twisted irony. Falkenhayn's strategy failed because he underestimated both French determination and German vulnerability. Germany had bled itself almost as white as France. The master of attrition had created mutual destruction instead of German victory. Verdun proved something horrifying about human nature. When pushed beyond all reasonable limits, people don't just break, they adapt. They find ways to survive in conditions that should destroy body and soul. They develop new tactics, new weapons, new forms of courage born from desperation. Pétain's rotation system had kept the French army functional while preserving some thread of humanity in conditions designed to destroy both. France emerged from Verdun, battered, bloodied, but unbroken. "They shall not pass" wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise kept at the cost of nearly everything France had to give. The defense of Verdun entered French national mythology as proof that some things are worth any sacrifice. But the cost had been so high that victory felt like defeat and survival felt like death. July 1st, 1916. 7:30 in the morning. What happened next was so catastrophically stupid that if you saw it in a movie, you'd say the director was exaggerating for dramatic effect. 60,000 British soldiers became casualties in a single day. 20,000 died. Most were killed in the first hour. Some units suffered 90% casualties before breakfast. It was the worst day in British military history, and it had been planned as the day that would end the war. General Douglas Haig had convinced himself that artillery could solve any military problem. For 7 days and nights, British guns had pounded German trenches with over 1.5 million shells. The bombardment could be heard across the Channel in southern England. Officers told their men they'd face little resistance. The Germans would be shell-shocked, demoralized, or dead. They were catastrophically, criminally wrong. Here's what the British didn't know. German trenches weren't just ditches in the ground. They were underground cities with concrete bunkers 40 feet deep, steel-reinforced positions, and tunnels connecting multiple defensive lines. When British shells fell, German soldiers went underground and played cards while waiting for the bombardment to end. Worse, much of the British ammunition was defective. Shells produced in hastily built factories by inexperienced workers often failed to explode. Others were filled with shrapnel designed to kill men in the open, not destroy concrete bunkers. The week-long bombardment had been an expensive fireworks display that achieved almost nothing. As British soldiers climbed from their trenches that morning, German machine gunners emerged from their bunkers, rubbed their eyes, and couldn't believe what they were seeing. Instead of the scattered, rushing attacks they'd trained to repel, British troops were advancing in neat lines at walking pace across open ground. It was like a shooting gallery with human targets. The British attack plan was based on assumptions so wrong they bordered on fantasy. Officers believed their artillery had cleared the way, so infantry was ordered to advance at walking pace to maintain formation. Soldiers carried 60-pound packs because they were expected to occupy German trenches immediately after arrival. Some units were specifically told to walk, not run, because running would indicate lack of confidence in the artillery preparation. 1.5. It was military planning designed by people who had never seen a machine gun in action. The 34th Division attacked at La Boisselle and walked 800 yards across no man's land toward German positions that had survived the bombardment completely intact. Machine gun fire cut them down in waves, not metaphorical waves, but actual visible lines of men falling simultaneously as bullets swept across their formation. By late morning, the division had already suffered thousands of casualties. By day's end, over 6,000. But the real tragedy lay in the units being destroyed, PALS battalions. These weren't professional soldiers. They were volunteers recruited from specific towns, under the promise they could serve alongside their friends, neighbours, and co-workers. The Bradford Pals, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Grimsby Chums, entire communities had enlisted together. It had seemed humanitarian in 1914. It became genocide in 1916. The Accrington Pals attacked German positions at Serre and were destroyed in 20 minutes. 735 men became casualties before most had finished their morning prayers. The small Lancashire town lost an entire generation faster than a church service. Streets that had celebrated mass enlistment in 1914 received mass death telegrams in 1916. Here's a detail that captures the horror. In some northern English towns, the postman stopped delivering telegrams and just posted casualty lists on the town hall door. Families would gather each morning to see if their sons, husbands, and fathers had died the previous day. Children learned to read by spelling out the names of dead neighbours. The Ulster Division attacked at Thiepval with Protestant volunteers from Belfast, who had spent more time fighting Irish Catholics than training for war. They advanced toward German wire that artillery had failed to cut, knowing they would die but hoping their sacrifice would matter. Some units actually reached German trenches through sheer courage, before being killed or driven back. By evening, Belfast newspapers were printing pages of death notices like a telephone directory of grief. Entire communities were being demographically destroyed in a single morning. Factories in northern towns struggled to operate as casualty lists emptied entire streets of workers. Britain was discovering that modern war could kill not just soldiers, but the social fabric that had created them. By noon, it was obvious that the first day had become a disaster of historic proportions. But Haig refused to admit failure. He ordered renewed attacks for the following days, then weeks, then months. What had begun as a single day's breakthrough attempt became a grinding campaign that consumed armies. In September, the British introduced a weapon that looked like science fiction, the tank. At Flers-Courcelette, the British committed 49 Mark I tanks, powered by clattering Daimler petrol engines and armed with naval guns. Only around 2/3 even reached the start line, and just a handful achieved their objectives. But they were immune to machine gun fire and could cross trenches that stopped infantry. German soldiers, seeing these mechanical monsters for the first time, fled in terror. A British observer reported, "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers, with the British army cheering behind." For a brief moment, it seemed like technology might solve the problem that had consumed 1 million lives. But the tanks were too few, too unreliable, and too early. They moved at walking pace, broke down constantly, and filled with carbon monoxide that poisoned their crews. Most got stuck in shell holes, broke down mechanically, or were knocked out by German artillery. Tanks were clearly the future, but that future was still years away. The Battle of the Somme dragged on through autumn rain and mud that turned the battlefield into a brown hell. October attacks gained hundreds of yards at the cost of thousands of lives. November, assaults captured villages that had been reduced to coloured marks on maps. By winter, British forces had advanced 6 miles at maximum depth, territory you could walk across in 2 hours. The final accounting defied human comprehension. British casualties, 420,000. French losses, about 200,000. German casualties, estimated between 450,000 and 600,000. Over 1 million men had become casualties for territorial gains measured in single-digit miles. But here's the most disturbing part. General Haig declared the Somme a victory. German forces had been weakened. Allied coordination had improved. Lessons had been learned that would lead to future success. He was technically correct and morally monstrous. The Battle of the Somme had achieved something beyond its territorial objectives. It had proven British forces could sustain major offensive operations. It had relieved pressure on French forces at Verdun. Most importantly, it had shown that German armies could be hurt, worn down, and forced to give ground. But in British towns where entire streets displayed mourning wreaths, strategic explanations offered no comfort. The volunteer army that had marched to war singing patriotic songs had been fed into an industrial killing machine and emerged as professional soldiers who understood the true price of modern warfare. The first day of the Somme entered British memory as the day innocents died. The PALS battalions, the idea that communities could go to war together and come home together, had been revealed as a beautiful, lethal delusion. What remained was a harder, darker understanding of what victory required in an industrial age. Britain had learned that modern war wasn't about courage, tactics, or even technology. It was about mathematics. Who could afford to lose more men, more resources, more of their national soul before the other side collapsed? And the British, it turned out, were very good at mathematics. While French and British armies were bleeding themselves white on land, the naval war exploded into the only major fleet engagement of the entire conflict. May 31st, 1916. The North Sea became a testing ground for a question that had haunted naval strategists for decades. Did Britain still rule the waves? The Battle of Jutland was everything naval theorists had predicted, and nothing the admirals expected. 250 warships, carrying the combined firepower to level entire cities, were about to discover whether decades of theory matched the reality of steel against steel. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe commanded the largest concentration of naval firepower in human history, 28 battleships and 9 battle cruisers that could destroy any land target on Earth. Admiral Reinhard Scheer led 16 battleships and 5 battle cruisers, outnumbered but hoping German engineering could overcome British numbers. For 2 years, both fleets had avoided decisive action. Now they would discover something terrifying. Modern naval warfare killed ships faster than anyone had imagined. The battle began with a catastrophe that redefined naval architecture. HMS Indefatigable, struck by German shells, exploded in a pillar of fire that could be seen 20 miles away. 1,100 men vaporized instantly, not killed, not drowned, but atomized by the explosion of their own ammunition. Minutes later, HMS Queen Mary suffered the same fate. Another 1,000 sailors deleted from existence in a flash of light and heat. Admiral David Beatty, watching his magnificent ships disappear, made the understatement of the war. There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today. There was indeed something wrong. British battle cruisers had sacrificed armor for speed and firepower. They looked magnificent, but couldn't survive direct hits from modern guns. When the main fleets engaged, the violence transcended human experience. 15-inch guns hurled shells weighing as much as automobiles across miles of ocean, at speeds that made them invisible. Direct hits could penetrate 3 feet of steel armor and detonate inside ships like volcanic eruptions. The noise was so intense that sailors' eardrums burst from concussion alone. But the decisive phases came in a series of brief, violent engagements over several hours, punctuated by Admiral Scheer's 2 brilliant battle turnaways that extracted the German fleet from certain destruction. German ships disappeared into North Sea mist, leaving the British in possession of empty water and Pyrrhic victory. The British claimed victory because the German fleet fled. The Germans claimed victory because they had sunk more tonnage and killed more sailors. Both were right and irrelevant. The real result was strategic checkmate. The German high seas fleet never again risked a major engagement, spending the rest of the war safely anchored, while Britain's blockade slowly strangled Germany. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia was achieving its final moment of military brilliance. General Alexei Brusilov had learned from 2 years of catastrophic failure and developed something revolutionary, tactics that actually worked. While other Russian commanders still believed in human waves against machine guns, Brusilov had created sophisticated combined arms operations that anticipated modern warfare. The Brusilov offensive began June 4th with attacks along a 200-mile front that caught Austrian defenders completely off guard. Instead of week-long bombardments that warned everyone, Brusilov used brief, intense barrages followed immediately by infantry assault. Instead of predictable single-point attacks, his forces struck simultaneously everywhere. The results were spectacular. Roughly 200,000 Austrian prisoners in the opening phase and advances tens of miles deep. The Austro-Hungarian army began disintegrating as Czech and Polish units surrendered en masse, rather than die for an empire they despised. German forces had to be rushed from Verdun to prevent total Austrian collapse, providing crucial relief to French defenders. But Brusilov's success attracted a disastrous participant, Romania. Romania looked at Austrian weakness, Russian advances, and German forces committed elsewhere and thought, perfect timing. King Ferdinand declared war on the Central Powers and invaded Transylvania in late August. It seemed like joining a winning team just before victory. Romania's participation lasted exactly 4 months, long enough to be completely destroyed. German and Bulgarian forces, commanded by August von Mackensen, invaded from the south, while German divisions transferred from France attacked from the north. Romanian armies, caught between 2 professional military machines, were systematically annihilated. By December, Bucharest had fallen, and Romanian resistance had ceased to exist. The Romanian disaster gave Germany something precious: access to Romanian oil fields and grain supplies that had been feeding Allied populations. Resources that might have sustained the Allies now sustained the German war effort. Romania's brief participation had backfired so spectacularly that it probably extended the war by months. By winter 1916, the strategic situation had crystallized into mutual exhaustion with a mathematical edge to the Allies. Verdun had proven that frontal assaults created mutual destruction. The Somme had demonstrated that even massive attacks achieved limited territorial gains. Jutland had confirmed naval stalemate. The Brusilov offensive had shown tactical brilliance couldn't overcome strategic limitations. Over 2 million men had become casualties in 1916 alone, more than the entire population of many countries. Entire societies were mobilizing for total war. Civilians were beginning to starve as resources flowed to military production. The war was consuming not just armies, but entire civilizations. Germany, despite tactical successes and brilliant generalship, was slowly losing the war of industrial attrition. The British naval blockade was strangling German imports. American industrial production was tilting the resource balance irreversibly toward the Allies. Time was running out for victory through conventional methods. 1916 had been the year when industrial warfare reached peak destructive efficiency. Modern armies could survive almost unlimited punishment while inflicting almost unlimited casualties. Technology and tactics had created perfect killing machines, but neither side could operate them decisively enough to end the war. But something was stirring beneath the surface. Revolution in Russia, American entry looming, new technologies that might break the deadlock. The old world was dying in trenches and battlefields across 3 continents. 1917 would bring revolution, revelation, and America. The year everything changed. March 8th, 1917. Petrograd. What started as women demanding bread became the collapse of the world's largest empire in exactly 8 days. It began with women who had nothing left to lose. Textile workers in the Vyborg district, hungry and desperate, walked out of their factories demanding bread. Within hours, they were joined by metal workers, then shopkeepers, then students. By evening, 200,000 people filled the streets, chanting, "Down with the Tsar!" The Romanov dynasty, which had survived Napoleon, the Decembrists, and 300 years of Russian winters, had 8 days left to live. Here's the most incredible part. Tsar Nicholas II was 300 miles away, completely oblivious to his empire's death. While revolution consumed his capital, he was at army headquarters, reading English novels and writing dismissively in his diary about some disorders in the capital. The most powerful autocrat on earth had become the most clueless man in Russia. What broke the Tsar's regime was breathtakingly simple. His own soldiers chose the people over the palace. On March 11th, troops ordered to fire on demonstrators instead turned their rifles on their officers. The Volinsky regiment mutinied first, then the Preobrazhensky guards, then entire garrisons. Soldiers, who had been fighting Germans for 3 years, decided they'd rather fight their own government. By March 12th, Petrograd was controlled by revolutionary workers and mutinous soldiers carrying the Tsar's own weapons. Nicholas finally realized his throne was disintegrating and decided to return to save his dynasty. But railway workers, now revolutionary sympathizers, had other plans. They diverted his imperial train to a siding in Pskov like he was a common passenger on the wrong line. The Tsar of all the Russias was literally railroaded by his own railroad workers. On March 15th, in a railway car at Pskov station, Nicholas II signed the document that ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The divine right of kings died with a pen stroke in a train compartment. The man who had believed God personally appointed him to rule Russia discovered that God's phone line had been disconnected. But here's the tragedy that would doom Russian democracy. Removing the Tsar didn't solve Russia's problems. It unleashed them all simultaneously. A provisional government formed under Alexander Kerensky, promising democracy, rights, and continued war against Germany. Simultaneously, workers and soldiers created their own councils, Soviets, demanding peace, land redistribution, and workers' control. Russia now had two governments claiming authority, both weak, both desperate, both doomed. Kerensky inherited a literally impossible situation. A lawyer turned politician, he genuinely believed Russia could become a democracy while fighting the most destructive war in human history. It was like trying to perform surgery while the patient was running a marathon during an earthquake. Every decision Kerensky made created new enemies. Continue the war, soldiers deserted en masse. Make peace, the Allies threatened to abandon Russia. Redistribute land, conservative officers plotted coups. Maintain property rights, peasants seized estates anyway. Kerensky was trapped in a political death spiral with no army, no money, and no time. Then Germany played the most cynical card in modern diplomatic history. On April 16th, a sealed railway car crossed from Germany into Russia carrying the most dangerous man on earth, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. German High Command had calculated that Lenin would destabilize Russia more effectively than any military campaign. They were so catastrophically correct that they created their own eventual destroyer. Lenin arrived at Finland Station like a political asteroid impact. While other revolutionaries debated constitutional procedures and democratic transitions, Lenin offered solutions so simple they sounded insane. Peace, land, bread. End the war, immediately. Redistribute all land to peasants. Transfer all power to workers' councils. It was radical, impossible, and exactly what exhausted Russians wanted to hear. But here's what makes Lenin's success even more incredible. His party numbered barely 25,000 members in a country of 170 million. Most Russians had never heard his name. Even within his own party, many Bolsheviks initially resisted his extreme ideas before his political genius and force of personality convinced them to follow his radical path. The man who would reshape world history started as a political nobody with a revolutionary plan. Then Kerensky made the decision that murdered Russian democracy. He launched one final military offensive. The July Kerensky Offensive was designed to restore Russian military credibility and democratic legitimacy. Instead, it destroyed both. Russian troops, already demoralized, suffered another 250,000 casualties for no strategic gain whatsoever. Soldiers blamed the democratic government for continuing a war they no longer understood, supported, or could win. Military discipline didn't just collapse, it reversed itself. Entire divisions elected their own officers. Soldiers shot commanders who ordered attacks. Military units simply walked away from the front, taking their weapons home to start local revolutions. Russia still had millions of men under arms, but they were no longer an army. They were an armed mob, heading in every direction except toward the Germans. Lenin seized this moment with surgical precision. While Kerensky's government debated democratic procedures and legal niceties, the Bolsheviks planned a coup with revolutionary efficiency. On October 25th, Bolshevik forces occupied key points in Petrograd with a shopping list of targets: telegraph offices, railway stations, government buildings, the central bank. The October Revolution was remarkably bloodless in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, symbol of imperial power, was defended by a women's battalion, some military cadets, and a few dozen Cossacks. After minimal fighting that produced only a handful of casualties, the Bolsheviks arrested the provisional government. World history changed hands with less violence than a typical urban riot. Kerensky escaped, disguised as a servant in a car borrowed from the American embassy. The man who had tried to democratize Russia fled his own capital like a fugitive. Democracy in Russia had lasted 8 months, shorter than most pregnancies, and significantly less successful. Lenin immediately announced Russia's withdrawal from the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 surrendered vast territories: Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, but gained something more valuable: the end of a war that was destroying Russian society faster than German armies ever could. The treaty was brilliant, short-term strategy, and catastrophic long-term planning for Germany. Yes, Germany could transfer millions of troops from east to west, but they also had to occupy vast new territories with troops they needed elsewhere, and they had created an ideological enemy far more dangerous than the Tsar had ever been. Lenin's revolution created something unprecedented: the world's first communist state committed to global revolution. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to rule Russia, they wanted to export revolution to every country on earth. They declared war on capitalism, democracy, and the entire existing world order. Germany's sealed train had delivered a virus that would consume the 20th century. Lenin's revolution would inspire communist movements from China to Cuba, create the Soviet Union, divide the world into competing ideological camps for 70 years, and ultimately outlast the German Empire that had created it. The most successful covert operation in history was also the most self-destructive. Germany had knocked Russia out of the war, but created an enemy that would eventually march into Berlin itself. January 19th, 1917. In a nondescript office building in London, British cryptographers decoded a telegram so explosive they initially thought it might be German disinformation designed to discredit Germany. It wasn't. It was German stupidity, so profound it defied rational explanation. The Zimmermann telegram was diplomatic suicide, disguised as diplomatic strategy. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had sent his ambassador in Mexico a proposal so insanely provocative that it seemed designed to drag America into the war. If America entered the conflict, Mexico should attack the United States and reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany would provide financial support and military assistance. The telegram also suggested Mexico should persuade Japan to join the anti-American alliance. Here's what makes this even more incredible. Mexico was in no position to accept such a proposal, even if they'd wanted to. The Mexican government was broke, barely controlled half their own country, and was fighting a brutal civil war. Asking Mexico to invade the United States was like asking a man with a broken leg to run a marathon against an Olympic sprinter. British intelligence sat on the telegram for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate this diplomatic nuclear bomb. That moment came in March, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and President Wilson was still desperately trying to maintain American neutrality. The British handed the Zimmermann telegram to American officials like a loaded gun pointed at Germany's head. When American newspapers published the telegram on March 1st, the reaction was volcanic. Headlines screamed, "Germany seeks alliance against US." Editorial cartoons showed German eagles and Mexican vultures circling Texas. Anti-German riots erupted across the country. Americans who had been indifferent to European warfare suddenly saw German submarines lurking off their coasts and German agents plotting to steal their southwestern states. Then Zimmermann did something so diplomatically naive, it bordered on political suicide. He publicly admitted sending the telegram. When reporters asked if it was genuine, the German Foreign Secretary said yes, he had sent it, and he saw nothing wrong with seeking alliances against potential enemies. Zimmermann thought honesty was better than denial, but his honesty was so perfectly timed to destroy German-American relations that it seemed like sabotage. President Woodrow Wilson faced the decision that would transform America from an isolated republic into a global superpower. For 3 years, he had kept America neutral through a combination of moral conviction and political calculation. "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight," he had said after the Lusitania sinking. Now that pride was being tested by German submarines, German plots, and German arrogance. Wilson was a former professor who genuinely believed in international law, moral diplomacy, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. But he was also a politician who understood that American public opinion had shifted decisively against Germany. The Zimmermann telegram had accomplished what 3 years of German atrocities couldn't. It had made Americans believe Germany threatened them personally, geographically, and immediately. Meanwhile, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st, the policy suspended after the Lusitania crisis. German naval commanders calculated they could starve Britain into submission before America could mobilize effectively. It was another German gamble, based on mathematical arrogance and strategic blindness, that ignored American industrial capacity. U-boats immediately began sinking American merchant ships with methodical efficiency. The steamer Housatonic was torpedoed on February 3rd. The tanker Illinois was sunk on March 18th. American sailors were dying in the Atlantic, killed by German torpedoes fired without warning against neutral vessels flying the American flag. Each sinking pushed America closer to inevitable war. On April 2nd, Wilson appeared before Congress to request a declaration of war with words that would echo through the 20th century. The world must be made safe for democracy. Wilson wasn't just asking Congress to fight Germany. He was asking America to remake the international order itself. But here's what most Americans didn't realize. Their country was spectacularly, almost comically unprepared for European warfare. The US Army numbered 133,000 men, smaller than some European divisions, and roughly equivalent to the police force of a large city. American factories were producing automobiles and consumer goods, not artillery shells and machine guns. The country had no experience mobilizing millions of men for overseas deployment against professional European armies. America was entering a war that had already consumed 10 million lives with military forces that could barely defend the East Coast. Congress passed the Selective Service Act in May, requiring all men between 21 and 30 to register for military service. The first lottery was held on July 20th with Secretary of War Newton Baker, blindfolded, drawing number 258 from a glass bowl. American democracy was selecting its warriors through a lottery system that looked more like a game show than military planning. Training camps sprouted across America like military mushrooms. Cantonment Devons in Massachusetts, Camp Gordon in Georgia, Camp Lewis in Washington. Millions of young men who had never left their home counties were learning to march, shoot, and follow orders from professional soldiers who had never commanded more than a few hundred troops in peacetime. The first American Expeditionary Force troops arrived in France in June 1917, led by General John J. Pershing. When Pershing visited Lafayette's tomb in Paris, he made the symbolic declaration, "Lafayette, we are here." It was a moment of poetic justice that masked practical problems. American troops were enthusiastic but inexperienced, well-equipped but untested, numerous but completely unprepared for the industrial slaughter they were entering. Most American forces wouldn't engage in major combat until mid-1918, which gave them crucial time to learn European warfare without facing its full horror immediately. Meanwhile, German U-boat warfare was achieving exactly what German admirals had predicted. Britain was starving. April 1917 became the worst month for Allied shipping losses in the entire war. 860,000 tons of vessels sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Britain was importing enough food to feed its population for only 6 weeks. German submarines were winning the war one merchant ship at a time, and victory seemed mathematically inevitable. Then the Allies stumbled onto a solution so obvious it seemed revolutionary: convoys. Instead of sending merchant ships individually across the Atlantic like scattered targets, they grouped them together under naval escort. U-boats that attacked convoys faced destroyers, depth charges, and coordinated anti-submarine warfare instead of defenseless cargo vessels. Shipping losses plummeted, while American troops and supplies crossed the Atlantic in ever-increasing numbers. General Pershing refused Allied demands to integrate American troops into British and French units as replacement fodder. "The United States will put its troops on the firing line when it shall have formed an army worthy of the American people," he declared. It was militarily sound and politically essential. America would fight as America, not as European cannon fodder. By autumn 1917, American soldiers were arriving in Europe at a rate of 50,000 per month, an entire division every few weeks. These doughboys brought something the war had consumed: fresh manpower, unlimited industrial capacity, and naive optimism about achieving decisive victory. The Zimmermann telegram had accomplished something no German military victory could have achieved. It had transformed American isolationism into American interventionism. Germany's attempt to keep America neutral had instead mobilized American public opinion for total war. The telegram had awakened the sleeping giant that would dominate the 20th century. America was no longer an isolated republic protected by 2 oceans. It was becoming the arsenal of democracy and the future global superpower. Germany's fatal diplomatic error had created the enemy that would ultimately defeat it. July 31st, 1917. Belgium. General Douglas Haig launched what he promised would be the final offensive of the war. Instead, he created a brown hell where hope went to drown. Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, began with the largest artillery bombardment in British history, 4.5 million shells fired in 10 days. The barrage was so intense it could be heard in London, across the English Channel. Haig believed this time would be different because this time artillery would obliterate German defenses completely. He was wrong in ways that redefined human suffering. Here's what Haig didn't understand about Belgian geography. The Ypres salient was the worst possible place for artillery bombardment. Belgian farmland sat just below sea level, kept dry by centuries of careful drainage engineering. 4.5 million shells didn't just destroy German trenches, they shattered the entire water management system that had kept this land habitable since medieval times. Then nature joined the assault on human sanity. August 1917 brought the wettest summer in Belgian memory. Rain that fell for days, then weeks, turning the battlefield into a brown liquid nightmare. Shell holes filled with water and became death traps. Wounded soldiers drowned in puddles too small to bathe a child. Stretcher bearers disappeared completely, swallowed by mud that had the consistency of cement and the smell of death. Canadian Corps Commander Arthur Currie walked the battlefield before the attack and delivered a prediction of mathematical precision to Haig. The offensive would cost 16,000 Canadian casualties for 4,000 yards of worthless mud. His estimate was exactly accurate. Haig ordered the attack anyway, convinced that German morale was about to collapse and one more push would end the war. What followed was 3 months of suffering that pushed human endurance beyond previously known limits. Men lived in shell holes filled with water and decomposing bodies. They slept standing up because lying down meant drowning. Some soldiers were buried alive so many times by collapsing trenches that they developed claustrophobia so severe they screamed when entering any enclosed space, including their own homes after the war. The mud at Passchendaele wasn't just mud. It was a mixture of Belgian clay, human blood, chemical explosives, and organic matter that created a substance unlike anything in nature. It had the consistency of thick porridge, the color of dried blood, and a smell that combined decomposition with industrial chemicals. Men who fell into deep mud couldn't climb out without help. Some simply gave up and drowned rather than struggle against the impossible weight. Medical evacuation became a nightmare within a nightmare. Wounded soldiers couldn't be carried on stretchers through the mud because stretcher bearers would sink and become trapped. Instead, the wounded were dragged on waterproof sheets or carried piggyback by men who often collapsed from exhaustion and joined the wounded they were trying to save. Many wounded died not from their injuries, but from drowning during evacuation attempts that took hours to cover distances measurable in yards. The psychological casualties created new categories of human breakdown. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, reached epidemic proportions among troops who experienced months of constant artillery bombardment. Men developed uncontrollable tremors, inability to speak, or catatonic stares that lasted for days. Some began laughing uncontrollably and couldn't stop. Others became convinced they were already dead and refused to eat, drink, or acknowledge other human beings. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, the Canadian military doctor who had written In Flanders Fields earlier in the war, was treating soldiers whose minds had completely fractured under the strain. He wrote to his mother, "I wish I could embody on paper some of the varied sensations of that 17 days. 17 days of Hades." McCrae died of pneumonia and meningitis in Boulogne in January 1918, another casualty of the war that was consuming everything it touched. Attack techniques developed for Passchendaele bordered on organized insanity. Soldiers were taught to advance by jumping from shell hole to shell hole, timing their movements between artillery barrages. Machine gun positions were identified by watching for muzzle flashes through rain and fog, since visual observation was impossible in daylight. Artillery targets were located by listening for German voices in the mist, since maps had become useless in landscape that changed daily. German defenders faced identical impossible conditions. Their concrete bunkers, designed to withstand artillery bombardment, became underwater prisons when the drainage system collapsed. Some German soldiers drowned in their own defensive positions, trapped by rising water in bunkers they couldn't escape. Others developed trench foot, so severe that their boots had to be cut off, taking skin and flesh with the leather. By October, the offensive had gained exactly 4.5 miles, the distance a healthy person could walk in 90 minutes on solid ground. British Empire casualties totaled 325,000 men. German losses were estimated at 260,000. Nearly 600,000 human beings had been killed, wounded, or driven permanently insane for less than 5 miles of Belgian swamp that was strategically worthless. The village of Passchendaele, the operation's final objective, no longer existed as anything recognizable. Aerial photographs showed only brown crater marks where a community had once housed families, businesses, and a church. Canadian forces finally captured the site on November 6th, but captured was meaningless, since there was nothing left to capture except mud, memories, and the ghosts of a 1,000-year-old Flemish village. But while Haig was drowning the British Empire in Belgian mud, something extraordinary was happening in a theatre most people had forgotten existed. General Edmund Allenby had been transferred from the Western Front to Palestine after his failures at Arras, what seemed like military exile to manage a colonial sideshow. Instead, Allenby was about to achieve something no Western Front general had managed since 1914: decisive, meaningful victory. The Palestine campaign was everything the Western Front wasn't: mobile, dynamic, and capable of producing actual strategic results. Allenby combined traditional cavalry charges with modern artillery, aircraft, and intelligence that created a new form of combined arms warfare. He had crucial help from Arab irregulars, led by Prince Faisal, and advised by a diminutive British intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia was the most improbable military genius of the war, a scholarly archaeologist who spoke fluent Arabic and had convinced feuding Arab tribes to unite against Turkish rule. Lawrence led camel-mounted raiders against Turkish railway lines, creating chaos behind enemy lines through guerrilla warfare that anticipated 20th century insurgency tactics. He was part scholar, part warrior, part theatrical performer, and completely effective at destroying Turkish logistics. The capture of Aqaba in July had demonstrated Lawrence's unconventional brilliance. Arab forces had approached the Turkish fortress from the landward side, the one direction Turkish defenders considered impossible because it required crossing the desert. The garrison surrendered with minimal resistance, giving the Allies a crucial naval base that opened southern Palestine to invasion. On October 31st, Allenby launched the Third Battle of Gaza, using tactics that would have been impossible on the Western Front: mobility, surprise, and cavalry charges. British horsemen charged Turkish positions with sabres drawn, like something from a Napoleonic battle. Australian light horse galloped across open desert toward enemy trenches, in attacks that succeeded through speed and shock rather than attrition. Turkish forces, weakened by Arab harassment and demoralized by defeats elsewhere, began retreating northward in increasing disorder. Allenby pursued with a combination of cavalry, armored cars, and aircraft that made Turkish retreat impossible and surrender inevitable. Within weeks, British forces were approaching Jerusalem, the holy city that had been under Ottoman control since 1517. On December 9th, Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, out of respect for the city's religious significance to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. He had specifically refused to enter mounted, saying no Christian general should ride triumphantly into the holy city. The gesture was perfect public relations that presented Allenby as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The capture of Jerusalem provided the Allies with their first unambiguous victory in months of otherwise futile slaughter. While hundreds of thousands were dying uselessly in the mud of Passchendaele, Allenby had achieved decisive strategic results with relatively light casualties. It proved that competent generalship could still produce meaningful victories, just not in France and Belgium, where the Western Front had become a suicide machine. Some historians argue that Passchendaele, despite its horrific cost, weakened the German army significantly before their final offensive efforts in 1918. But Jerusalem's symbolic importance couldn't disguise the strategic reality. The war would be won or lost on the Western Front, where Haig's impossible dream of breakthrough had drowned in Belgian mud. By December 1917, the Western Front had consumed another year of industrial slaughter without decisive strategic result. Passchendaele had gained 5 miles of worthless swamp. The Somme had proven British determination, but achieved no breakthrough. Verdun remained French, but had nearly destroyed the French army. Yet the strategic balance was shifting toward inevitable Allied victory. Russia was leaving the war, freeing German divisions for transfer westward. But America was entering with unlimited resources and growing military capability. The question for 1918 was mathematically simple. Could Germany achieve victory with Russian troops before American troops arrived in decisive numbers? Haig's dream of breakthrough had drowned in the mud of Passchendaele, along with 250,000 casualties. But Allenby's success in Palestine proved that decisive victory remained possible for commanders smart enough to fight where victory was achievable, rather than where national pride demanded sacrifice. As 1918 dawned, Germany faced a terrible choice: win everything in one final gamble, or lose everything in slow-motion collapse. March 21st, 1918. 5 o'clock in the morning. General Erich Ludendorff launched Germany's final throw of the dice with one of the most devastating artillery bombardments in military history. 6,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front, firing 3.5 million shells in 5 hours, more explosive power than most countries had used in entire wars. The earth shook from the Channel to Switzerland. British soldiers were buried alive by the bombardment, their trenches collapsing like sandcastles. This was Operation Michael, Germany's last chance to win the war before American reinforcements made victory impossible. Ludendorff had done the mathematics of desperation. Thanks to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Germany could transfer about 40 divisions from the Eastern to the Western Front. For the first time since 1914, Germany had numerical superiority in the West. But American troops were arriving at a rate of 250,000 to 350,000 per month. Germany's window for victory was measured in weeks, not months. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its desperation. German forces would smash through British lines, drive northwest toward the Channel ports, and separate the British Expeditionary Force from French armies. With Britain isolated and France exposed, both would be forced to seek peace. It was the Schlieffen Plan reborn, everything or nothing. But Ludendorff had learned from 3 years of failure. Instead of massive frontal assaults, Germany would use revolutionary new tactics. Stormtroopers, elite assault troops armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and machine pistols, would infiltrate enemy lines through surprise and speed rather than overwhelming force. The stormtroopers were everything traditional. Infantry wasn't. Small, fast, flexible, and deadly. They advanced in small groups, bypassing strong points rather than attacking them directly. Most importantly, they were trained to exploit success rather than reinforce failure. If one group met resistance, others would flow around it, like water around rocks. When the bombardment lifted at 9:40 a.m., stormtroopers emerged from the morning fog like ghosts from hell. British defenders, stunned by 5 hours of intensive shelling, found German soldiers already inside their trenches before they could man their machine guns. Positions that had been impregnable for 4 years fell in minutes. The breakthrough was spectacular, beyond anyone's expectations. By the end of the first day, German forces had advanced 8 miles, farther than any attack since 1914. The British Fifth Army began disintegrating under the assault. Entire divisions retreated in confusion, abandoning equipment and supplies. Within a week, German forces had advanced 40 miles and created a massive salient bulging into Allied lines. On March 23rd, the Paris gun began shelling the French capital from 120 kilometers away. Ludendorff's gamble seemed to be paying off beyond his wildest expectations. But success created its own catastrophic problems. German stormtroopers, advancing faster than planned, outran their supply lines completely. Most critically, German troops, many of whom hadn't seen adequate food in months due to the British blockade, stopped to loot captured British supply depots instead of pressing their advantage. The sight of abundant Allied food supplies had a devastating effect on German morale. Soldiers discovered British trenches stocked with white bread, canned meat, chocolate, and tobacco, luxuries that had disappeared from Germany years earlier. Some German units spent entire days eating captured food, rather than advancing toward victory. Meanwhile, the crisis had finally forced the Allies to unite under a single commander. On March 26th, General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Generalissimo, Supreme Commander of Allied forces. For the first time since 1914, the Allies would fight as a unified force. His first order was characteristically direct. I will fight in front of Amiens. I will fight in Amiens. I will fight behind Amiens. Ludendorff tried to maintain momentum with additional offensives. Operation Georgette targeted British forces in Flanders. Operation Blucher York struck French positions along the Aisne River. Each attack achieved initial success, but none delivered the decisive breakthrough Germany desperately needed. The problem was mathematical. Germany was trading irreplaceable veterans for temporary territorial gains. Stormtroopers were elite troops who took months to train and years to replace. Each successful attack consumed Germany's best soldiers at a rate the country couldn't sustain. By June, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. German offensives had gained territory, but achieved no decisive results. Allied armies had regrouped under unified command. Most importantly, American forces were arriving at an unprecedented rate. The final German offensive, Operation Mahn Reims, launched on July 15th. This time, Allied intelligence had broken German codes and knew the attack was coming. French artillery caught German stormtroopers in the open and slaughtered them before they could reach Allied trenches. The offensive lasted 3 days before German forces were forced to retreat. It was the first German attack since March that had failed to gain significant ground. More ominously, it was the first time German forces had been forced to retreat by Allied counterattacks. Ludendorff's spring offensive had gained more territory than any campaign since 1914. But Germany had exhausted its reserves in a gamble that had failed. The spring and summer offensives had consumed roughly 800,000 German casualties, including the irreplaceable stormtroopers. American forces were making their presence felt with shocking effectiveness. At Cantigny, Château-Thierry, and Belleau Wood, American troops demonstrated they could fight and win against veteran German forces. Fresh American divisions were bringing new energy to a war Germany could no longer sustain. By July, Ludendorff's final gamble had failed catastrophically. Germany had thrown everything into the spring offensive and achieved tactical success without strategic victory. The window for German victory was closing as American reinforcements continued arriving while German reserves dwindled to nothing. The initiative was about to pass to the Allies. And when it did, Germany would discover that 4 years of defensive warfare had not prepared it for strategic retreat. August 8th, 1918, 4:20 in the morning. Near the French town of Amiens, over 400 tanks began rolling toward German lines like a mechanical avalanche that would bury the German Empire. Over 400 tanks advanced through morning fog, with 18 Allied divisions following behind. There was no prolonged preliminary artillery bombardment to warn German defenders. The first sound German soldiers heard was grinding steel tracks and roaring aircraft engines as Allied forces launched the most sophisticated combined arms attack of the war. General Erich Ludendorff would later call August 8th the Black Day of the German army. It was the day Germany discovered that while they had been perfecting offensive tactics, the Allies had been perfecting something far more dangerous: victory itself. The Battle of Amiens was everything previous offensives hadn't been: carefully planned, properly coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Canadian and Australian troops, supported by tanks and preceded by a creeping artillery barrage, advanced 8 miles on the first day. German resistance didn't just break, it disintegrated like sugar in rain. For the first time in the war, entire German units surrendered without serious resistance. The 2nd Guards Division, elite troops who had held their positions for 4 years, simply melted away. German prisoners told their captors they were fed up with the war and grateful to be safely out of the fighting. But the real shock was psychological. German reinforcements marching toward the front were jeered by retreating troops who called them strike-breakers and war prolongers. The discipline that had sustained the German army through 4 years of slaughter was finally cracking under the weight of inevitable defeat. Within days, what had started as a local Allied attack became a general offensive along the entire Western Front. American forces launched their first major independent offensive at Saint-Mihiel. British armies began advancing against the Hindenburg Line. The Allies had finally learned how to fight the war they had been trying to fight since 1914. Instead of massive frontal assaults, they used tanks, aircraft, and artillery in coordinated attacks that exploited German weaknesses. The Western Front suddenly became fluid as German armies fell back toward their own borders. The 100 Days Offensive had begun, the final campaign that would destroy the German Empire and reshape the world. But Germany's military collapse was only part of a larger disintegration. The Central Powers alliance began falling apart as each member sought separate peace with the Allies. Bulgaria was the first domino to fall. Allied forces attacking from Salonika broke through Bulgarian defences at Dobropol in September. The Bulgarian army simply stopped fighting and went home. Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29th. The Ottoman Empire followed within weeks. General Allenby's forces had captured Damascus and Aleppo. Turkish armies could no longer sustain organized resistance. On October 30th, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice at Mudros that effectively ended 4 centuries of Turkish rule in the Middle East. Austria-Hungary died most dramatically, torn apart by the very nationalism it had tried to suppress. Czech and Polish units mutinied against their Austrian officers. Hungarian politicians declared independence. South Slavs proclaimed union with Serbia. The empire didn't just lose the war, it ceased to exist as a political entity. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice at Villa Giusti. The Habsburg monarchy formally dissolved into component nationalities that had been waiting 4 years for liberation. The war that had begun with Franz Ferdinand's assassination ended with the complete destruction of the empire he had died representing. Germany now stood alone against the entire world. But even as military defeat became inevitable, another enemy was claiming more lives than all the armies combined. The Spanish flu pandemic was killing soldiers and civilians with indiscriminate efficiency. The flu was particularly cruel to young, healthy adults, exactly the demographic that had been fighting the war. Soldiers who had survived 4 years of artillery and poison gas died in their bunks from a virus that turned their immune systems against them. Some military units lost more men to influenza than to enemy action. The pandemic struck with apocalyptic intensity. In India, approximately 12 million people perished, more than twice the military casualties of the entire war. The pandemic killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, making it more deadly than the war it accompanied. The flu hit Germany particularly hard because the British blockade had weakened civilian health through years of malnutrition. German soldiers and workers had little resistance to the pandemic. Cities like Berlin and Hamburg became plague zones where the living could barely bury the dead. By October, German resistance was collapsing on multiple fronts simultaneously. Military defeat, political revolution, economic collapse, and pandemic disease were converging to destroy the German Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm's advisors warned him that Germany had weeks before complete societal collapse. American forces proved their worth in the largest battle in US military history. The Meuse-Argonne offensive committed over 1 million American troops to breaking final German defensive positions. It cost 26,000 American dead, but was decisive. German forces could no longer hold their lines against combined Allied attacks. The dam had finally burst after 4 years of stalemate. 4 years of deadlock ended in 6 weeks of German collapse. The Western Front became a race as German armies retreated faster than Allied forces could pursue them. But the most dramatic collapse was yet to come. As German armies retreated in the field, German society was beginning to revolt at home. November 3rd, 1918. Kiel, Germany. The German High Seas Fleet, the pride of the Kaiser's navy that had cost a fortune and achieved nothing, received orders for a final, suicidal attack against the British Grand Fleet. Instead of sailing to glorious defeat, the sailors mutinied and ended the war. It began with the stokers and engine crews, who simply refused to fire the boilers that would take them to pointless death. Within hours, entire ships' crews had joined the revolt. Red flags appeared on battleships that had been built to challenge British naval supremacy. The fleet that was supposed to die gloriously for the fatherland, instead declared that the war was over and they were going home. The naval mutiny spread like wildfire through Germany's exhausted military and starving civilian populations. Soldiers returning from the Western Front brought news of inevitable defeat and imminent Allied invasion. Workers in Berlin went on strike demanding peace, bread, and an end to imperial madness. Revolution erupted in Munich, where Bavarian socialists declared an independent republic. The German Empire was disintegrating from within as rapidly as it was being defeated from without. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had started the war with promises of quick victory and German dominance, found himself powerless to control the forces he had unleashed. His generals told him the army could no longer be relied upon to fight or obey orders. His admirals reported that the navy was in open revolt against the war itself. His civilian advisors warned that revolution was spreading to every major German city. On November 9th, faced with the choice between abdication and civil war that would destroy Germany completely, Wilhelm chose exile. He boarded his imperial train for the last time and fled to the Netherlands, abandoning the throne his family had held for decades. The Kaiser, who had promised to make Germany the dominant power in Europe, ended his reign as a refugee seeking asylum from his own subjects. Within hours of the Kaiser's flight, Social Democrat politicians in Berlin proclaimed the German Republic. Friedrich Ebert, a former saddlemaker, became provisional chancellor of a country that had been ruled by emperors for centuries. The transition from monarchy to republic happened so quickly that most Germans learned about it from newspaper headlines, rather than witnessing the change themselves. But political revolution was only one of Germany's multiple, simultaneous crises. The country was militarily defeated, economically ruined, socially collapsing, and facing complete occupation by hostile forces. The new government's first priority was ending the war before Germany ceased to exist as a functioning state. German negotiators had been seeking an armistice since early October, when General Ludendorff finally admitted that military victory was impossible and Germany faced complete destruction. The negotiations were conducted through President Wilson, who insisted on terms that would prevent Germany from resuming the war. Germany would have to evacuate all occupied territory, surrender its submarines and aircraft, and accept Allied occupation of strategic positions along the Rhine. The armistice negotiations took place in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, the same car where Marshal Foch had coordinated Allied strategy during Germany's spring offensive. It was poetic justice that Germany's surrender would be signed in the mobile headquarters of the man who had unified Allied resistance and defeated German ambitions. On November 11th, at 5 o'clock in the morning, German representatives signed the armistice agreement that ended 4 years of unprecedented slaughter. The fighting would stop at 11 o'clock, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It was a moment of mathematical poetry that would be remembered as long as people studied the history of human conflict. But the war didn't end cleanly at 11 a.m. as planned. Fighting continued until the final minute, as commanders on both sides sought last-moment victories or settled old scores with final acts of violence. Some officers, unable to accept that 4 years of sacrifice had ended in total defeat, ordered final attacks that served no military purpose except personal pride. Private Henry Gunther of Baltimore became one of the war's final casualties when he charged a German machine gun position at 10:59 a.m. on November 11th. German soldiers, knowing the war would end in 1 minute, tried to wave him back to safety. When Gunther continued advancing with his rifle, they reluctantly shot him dead. He died 1 minute before the armistice took effect, possibly the last soldier killed in the Great War. At exactly 11 o'clock, an unnatural silence fell across the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. Artillery that had been firing continuously since 1914 suddenly stopped. Machine guns that had dominated the battlefield fell silent. Soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches and stared at each other across no man's land, uncertain what to do without the constant sound of gunfire and explosions. Some Allied soldiers cheered and celebrated the end of their nightmare. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process that the war was finally over. Many simply slept, exhausted by 4 years of violence, terror, and industrial-scale death. The silence was so complete that soldiers reported being able to hear birds singing for the first time since 1914. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds filled the streets in wild celebration. Church bells rang, sirens wailed, and people danced in the streets with strangers. The war that had consumed a generation was finally over. Democracy had defeated autocracy. Freedom had triumphed over militarism. The world was safe for democracy at last. But in Berlin, Vienna, and Constantinople, there was only exhaustion, uncertainty, and the beginning of a reckoning with catastrophic defeat. Empires that had ruled for centuries had ceased to exist. Millions were dead, millions more were refugees, and entire societies faced reconstruction from physical and moral ruins. The Great War had officially ended at 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918. But its consequences would shape the rest of the 20th century and beyond. New nations were being born from the ashes of old empires. America had emerged as a global superpower. Russia had become the world's first communist state. The international order that had existed since Napoleon had been completely destroyed. The guns fell silent at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. But the dying had only just begun. November 11th, 1918. 11 o'clock in the morning. The guns fell silent, and humanity began counting the price of its collective madness. The numbers were staggering, though historians still debate exact totals. Approximately 9.7 million soldiers dead, some 20 to 21 million wounded, several million civilian deaths, with estimates varying depending on how conflicts and famines are counted. But statistics couldn't capture the true cost of what Europe had done to itself in 4 years of industrial slaughter. These figures would soon be overshadowed by an even deadlier enemy. The 1918-19 influenza pandemic swept across war-weakened populations, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide, more than the war itself. The pandemic hit hardest in regions already devastated by conflict, malnutrition, and social collapse. France had lost approximately 1.4 million men, an entire generation of farmers, workers, teachers, and artists who would never return to rebuild their shattered nation. In some French villages, every man between 18 and 35 was dead. Memorial walls in country churches listed more names than the villages had living residents. Britain had sacrificed nearly 1 million soldiers, including much of its intellectual and social elite. The PALS battalions that had marched away singing in 1914 had been decimated on the Somme, at Passchendaele, in dozens of forgotten trenches. Oxford and Cambridge lost entire graduating classes. Germany suffered over 2 million military deaths, and the defeat precipitated revolution, hunger, and political crisis. The nation that had started the war with dreams of European dominance ended it facing revolution, starvation, and national humiliation. Russia's losses were almost incomprehensible. Over 3 million soldiers dead, with millions more wounded, missing, or captured. The empire that had possessed the world's largest army had been destroyed by war, revolution, and civil conflict. Austria-Hungary ceased to exist as both an empire and a casualty list. Approximately 1.5 million dead from a state that no longer appeared on any map. But the visible wounds were only part of the catastrophe. Over 20 million wounded soldiers returned to their homes carrying the war in their bodies and minds. Men with missing limbs learned to navigate a world designed for the whole. Amputees fitted with crude prosthetics tried to reclaim lives that had been shattered along with their bodies. The psychological casualties created an entirely new category of human suffering. Shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans who had survived the war physically but not mentally. Men who had been farmers couldn't tolerate thunder because it reminded them of artillery. Former teachers jumped at sudden noises and couldn't sleep without nightmares. Some veterans developed soldier's heart, rapid heartbeat and shortness of breath triggered by combat memories. Others suffered from war neurosis that left them unable to concentrate, work, or maintain relationships. The invisible wounds would claim victims for decades after the armistice. The economic cost was enormous by contemporary standards, equivalent to many billions in today's dollars. Resources that could have built universities, hospitals, and infrastructure had been converted into shells, bullets, and poison gas that accomplished nothing except destruction. European currencies collapsed under war debt. The British pound, once the world's reserve currency, was permanently weakened. The German mark would suffer catastrophic inflation in the early 1920s. France owed massive debts that would constrain its economy for generations. Infrastructure across Europe lay in ruins. Northern France and Belgium were moonscapes of shell craters and destroyed towns. Railway lines had been torn up, bridges destroyed, factories demolished. The rebuilding would take decades, and cost fortunes that war-bankrupt nations could barely afford. Perhaps the most profound loss was cultural and spiritual. The optimism that had characterized European civilization before 1914 was gone forever. The belief in progress, in the civilizing power of education and industry, in the basic decency of human nature, all had been destroyed in the trenches. A generation of artists, writers, poets, and intellectuals had been killed before they could create works that might have enriched human civilization. The lost generation wasn't just a literary term, it was a demographic reality. Europe had sacrificed its future to settle 19th century quarrels with 20th century weapons. Women who had lost husbands, sons, and brothers faced lives of permanent mourning and economic hardship. Children grew up fatherless in societies organized around male authority and economic contribution. The social fabric that had held European civilization together for centuries had been torn apart and would never be fully repaired. As the survivors counted their losses, one thing was clear: the world that had existed before 1914 was gone forever. What remained was a continent of widows, orphans, and broken men trying to rebuild from ruins. January 18th, 1919. The Palace of Versailles. Where French kings had once entertained European royalty, Allied leaders gathered to remake the world from the ashes of 4 empires. They would create a peace so flawed it helped make another war more likely. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris as the prophet of a new world order. His 14 points promised self-determination for all peoples, open diplomacy, free trade, and a League of Nations to settle future disputes peacefully. Wilson genuinely believed the Great War could be the last war if nations embraced democratic ideals and international cooperation. He was about to discover that idealism was no match for European realpolitik. David Lloyd George of Britain wanted to preserve British imperial interests while preventing Germany from ever again challenging British naval supremacy. Georges Clemenceau of France, nicknamed the Tiger, wanted revenge, security, and reparations that would keep Germany weak permanently. Vittorio Orlando of Italy wanted territorial gains that would compensate for Italian sacrifices. The negotiations lasted 6 months and produced treaties that satisfied no one while creating conditions that would contribute to future conflicts. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after Franz Ferdinand's assassination, was designed to punish Germany so severely it could never threaten European peace again. Instead, it created resentments that would fester for decades. Germany lost approximately 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations administration for 15 years. The Rhineland would be permanently demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces. Poland received access to the sea through the Polish corridor that split Germany in two. Germany's military was reduced to a police force. The army was limited to 100,000 men. The navy could have no submarines, no aircraft carriers, and only 6 battleships. Germany was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or poison gas. Most humiliating was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which became a legal basis for reparations and proved politically explosive. Germany would pay reparations not just for direct war damage, but for pensions to Allied veterans and support for war widows. The final bill was set at 132 billion gold marks, often translated as roughly $33 billion at the time, an enormous sum that would dominate diplomacy and German politics for decades, as reparations were repeatedly renegotiated. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist who witnessed the negotiations, warned that the treaty was a Carthaginian peace that would either destroy Germany economically or create conditions for future war. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, he wrote, vengeance will not limp. He was prophetically correct. While Germany was being dismembered, new nations were being born from the corpses of dead empires. Poland emerged after 123 years of foreign rule, reconstructed from German, Austrian, and Russian territories. Czechoslovakia was created from Austro-Hungarian remnants, combining Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, and other minorities in an artificial state. Yugoslavia united South Slavs under Serbian leadership, creating another multi-ethnic powder keg. Hungary was reduced to 1/3 of its former size, losing territory to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Austria became a tiny German-speaking republic, forbidden from uniting with Germany. The Ottoman Empire was carved up among the victors. The Middle East settlements were particularly problematic. During the war, Britain had promised Arabs independence in exchange for revolt against the Turks. Britain had also promised Jews a national home in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. Simultaneously, Britain and France had secretly agreed to divide Ottoman territories between themselves. All three promises were impossible to fulfill simultaneously. The mandate system was created to disguise European imperialism as international trusteeship. Britain received mandates for Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. As one British official later noted, new borders were drawn casually in far-off offices, a process that would have long consequences for regional stability. The arbitrary borders grouped hostile, ethnic and religious communities together while separating natural allies. The Middle East would pay the price for this geographic malpractice for the next century. Wilson's League of Nations was established, but without American participation. The US Senate rejected membership, fearing entanglement in European conflicts. The organization designed to prevent future wars was crippled from birth by the absence of the world's emerging superpower. The peace settlement created as many problems as it solved. Ethnic Germans found themselves trapped in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other new states. Hungarians were scattered across multiple countries. Arabs discovered that independence meant trading Turkish rule for British and French colonialism. Economic nationalism replaced the international cooperation Wilson had envisioned. New nations erected trade barriers to protect infant industries. Currency instability made international commerce difficult. The global economy that had facilitated prosperity before 1914 was replaced by competing national economies. Most ominously, the peace settlement left millions of people feeling betrayed, humiliated, or cheated. Germans believed they had been unfairly blamed for a war they hadn't started alone. Italians felt they hadn't received adequate compensation for their sacrifices. Arabs realized that Western promises of self-determination applied only to Europeans. These resentments would fester for 2 decades before contributing to an even more devastating conflict. The peace treaties that ended the Great War were masterpieces of short-term thinking and long-term instability. They created a European order so unstable it was bound to face future crises. The statesmen who gathered at Versailles believed they were creating lasting peace. Instead, they had helped write the opening chapters of the next World War. October 1918. While convalescing in a military hospital near Pacewalk, the news of Germany's defeat helped fuel the outrage and sense of betrayal that an Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler would later exploit. As he later wrote about learning of defeat, everything went black before my eyes. In that moment of despair and rage, the seeds of an even greater catastrophe began to germinate. Hitler's reaction was shared by millions of Germans who felt betrayed by defeat and humiliated by the peace settlement. The stab-in-the-back myth, the false belief that Germany had been betrayed by politicians rather than defeated militarily, would become the foundation of Nazi ideology. The former corporal would spend the next 25 years plotting revenge. Meanwhile, in Russia, Vladimir Lenin was consolidating the world's first communist state, while a Georgian revolutionary named Joseph Stalin quietly accumulated power within the Bolshevik Party. The Russian Revolution had removed the Tsar, but replaced him with something potentially more dangerous, an ideological state committed to exporting revolution worldwide. Across the Atlantic, America retreated into isolationism after briefly emerging as a world power. The Senate's rejection of the League of Nations symbolized American disillusionment with European entanglements. The country that could have guaranteed international stability instead withdrew behind its ocean barriers, leaving Europe to manage its own destructive rivalries. The Great War had solved none of the fundamental problems that had caused it. Nationalism was stronger than ever, now armed with the principle of self-determination. Imperial competition continued under new forms. Military technology had advanced to even more destructive levels. The balance of power that had maintained European peace since Napoleon had been completely destroyed. Economic instability would soon trigger the Great Depression, which would radicalize politics across Europe. Democratic governments would prove incapable of managing mass unemployment and social unrest. Fascist and communist movements would offer simple solutions to complex problems. The peace settlement had created grievances and structural problems that, combined with economic collapse and radical politics, helped make another major conflagration more likely. Germany felt humiliated and sought revenge. Russia had become a revolutionary state committed to destroying the capitalist world order. Japan felt excluded from Western decision-making and sought to create its own empire in Asia. 20 years after the armistice, Europe would again descend into total war. The second conflict would be even more destructive than the first, consuming an estimated 50 to 70 million lives and reshaping global civilization. The Great War hadn't ended anything. It had helped create the conditions for an even greater catastrophe. The lights had gone out across Europe in 1914 and had never truly been relit. The world that died in the trenches of the Western Front would be replaced by something darker, more violent, and more ideologically divided. The war to end all wars had instead begun the century of total war.